Backpacking is an incredible way to get to see some remote and beautiful places while still getting a healthy dose of exercise at the same time. I love backpacking so much that I started an entire YouTube channel about it. I've done it for thousands of miles over the years. I've hiked the Appalachian Trail, most of the Pacific Crest Trail, and a bunch of other stuff. And I'm not gonna lie, I have had a few what you could call close calls, I guess, during some of those adventures that could have cost me my life. But I'm okay. I'm here right now, and anytime that I've gone backpacking, I've always made it out of the wilderness alive and completely unscathed. And while that is usually the case for others who go backpacking, on rare occasion, hikers don't make it out alive. In fact, sometimes they just up and vanish altogether. From the Appalachian Trail to the Pacific Crest Trail and every trail in between, I've covered numerous stories on this channel about backpacking trips gone wrong. And for this video, I've decided to just combine all of these stories into one marathon-long compilation of backpacking mysteries, disappearances, and even potential murders. And so to start us off, let's take a trip together to a little known trail that I actually hiked myself years after this story took place, called the Northville Placid Trail. This trip is totally free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission, and of course, to help us reach our ambitious goal of 1 million subscribers. On October 20th, 1990, a small group of hunters set out into the Adirondack wilderness. It was the first day of hunting season, and they figured the wilderness in the Louis Lake area would provide them their best chance to shoot a deer. They hiked out on the Sucker Brook Trail for a few miles and eventually moved off trail looking for a good spot to set up. But instead of finding a deer, they found a red United States Postal Service sweatshirt hung on a stick. This was a bizarre and even disturbing find because they were miles into the wilderness at this point and they had already left the established trail. One of the hunters took a closer look and noticed what looked like an abandoned tent pitched close to a brook. Describing it like that does make it sound pretty eerie, but it's not exactly unheard of or uncommon for people to find abandoned camping equipment in the woods. What this hunter discovered next, however, is extremely rare and extremely frightening. Not far from the campsite, the hunter discovered a badly decomposed body lying face down in the brook. With this discovery in mind, the hunters quickly realized that what they had stumbled upon was not just an abandoned campsite, but rather a site where a man lived and ultimately died through a total nightmare scenario. The hunters had just accidentally solved the disappearance of a thru hiker who had seemingly vanished on the Northville Placid Trail 5 months earlier. This is the relatively unknown story of David Boomhower. Many of the hiking stories and mysteries I cover on this channel are pretty well known. And while I do think there's value in me retelling them, especially because I'm coming at it from the perspective of an actual hiker, most of these stories have been told time and time again on lots of other YouTube channels. Today's story, however, is one that I'm sure most of you have never heard before. To my knowledge, it's never been told on YouTube before, at least in a video that received a lot of attention. There's almost zero articles or information or even photos about this story online. I could actually only find one photo of David Boomhower himself, and it's this lost poster. Really, the only place I was able to find any information about this story is in the book At the Mercy of the Mountains by Peter Bronsky. And even though it's a relatively unknown story, it's an important one, and it's a sobering reminder of what can go wrong when you're unprepared in the mountains. In early June of 1990, David Boomhower needed a change in his life. The 38-year-old United States Postal Service worker had recently gone through a messy divorce with his wife of 7 years. She had recently remarried, and her new husband was who else but Boomhower's best friend. The three of them had even been living under the same roof for like 6 months, but Boomhower was eventually asked to leave, and he set out for the mountains shortly thereafter. Despite these really difficult, to say the least, circumstances that he was living through, Boomhower was allegedly in pretty good spirits at the time. He had spent months training for a thru hike of the Northville Placid Trail, running up to 60 miles per week, lifting weights, and getting his diet in order. He must have felt fully prepared because on June 5th, 1990, David Boomhower traveled to the Adirondacks and took his first steps on the 140-mile hiking trail. The Northville Placid Trail, or NPT for short, runs south to north, and its name is very intuitive. It starts in the small town of Northville, New York, and winds through the valleys and lake shores of the remote Adirondack wilderness until reaching the town of Lake Placid, the trail's northern terminus. I have to mention here that I have a deep appreciation for this trail because in 2020, my friend Flossie and I hiked the entire thing, and in 2015, a different friend and I also attempted to hike it, although we did fall short of completing the whole thing. Much of the footage and B-roll in this video was taken by me personally. And so believe me when I tell you, this trail is tough. It's rugged, the weather can be brutal, and it's incredibly remote. Even today, this trail doesn't receive that much foot traffic, and so I can only imagine that back in 1990, before thru hiking was as popular as it is now, it probably wasn't uncommon for NPT thru hikers to encounter no other human beings during the course of their hike. The first few miles of the trail are on paved roads, and many NPT hikers opt to skip this section of the trail and actually start at the Benson Road trailhead instead. This was Boomhower's plan, and on his first day, he hiked 8.3 miles and stopped for the night at the Silver Lake Lean-To. I also just gotta say, this is kind of eerie for me because that's exactly what I did the first time back in 2015. When I attempted to hike this trail. He intended to finish his thru hike on June 15th, allocating him 10 days for the journey. On day 2, he made it roughly 10 miles to the Sacandaga River at an old settlement called White House. On day 3, he hiked through the small town of Piseco, New York, and passing by the post office where he mailed a postcard to his sister. And then, on day 4, David Boomhower entered the West Canada Lakes Wilderness. West Canada Lakes is a part of the Northville Placid Trail that's always stuck out to me because it's extremely remote. At its heart, which the NPT goes right through, by the way, you're a full day's hike minimum from the nearest road. And that nearest road is most likely just gonna be a dirt access road that receives little to no traffic. Though there's no official metric for this, a lot of people think, myself included, that the West Canada Lakes Wilderness is essentially the most remote part of all of New York State. Which is ironic because it's actually here that David Boomhower had his only known human contact during his hike. Just before 10 a.m. on June 8th, Boomhower met Paul Wilbur, who was fishing near Cedar Lake Dam just off of the Northville Placid Trail. I don't think the two talked long or even much at all, but Wilbur did notice that Boomhower's pack looked awkward. There was like tent poles protruding out at odd angles. We now know that Boomhower was struggling physically on the day that he met Wilbur, but he made no mention of this to the man. He didn't ask for help. He said nothing about it whatsoever. Paul Wilbur would end up being the last person to ever see Boomhower alive. And after this, Boomhower would seemingly vanish into the Adirondack wilderness. He had told his family that his hike would be finished on June 15th, and so when they didn't hear from him by June 17th, his family started to get extremely worried. The authorities were contacted and they immediately began searching. And the first thing that they searched were the trail registers spaced out along the NPT. The trails in New York, as well as a lot of other places for that matter, have a robust system of logbooks stationed out at various trailheads, road crossings, and campsites. Hikers are asked to sign and date each one, providing basic information on which direction they are traveling and when they were there. Fortunately for the searchers, David Boomhower had been very consistent in signing these logbooks, and so investigators were able to follow his trail of signatures all the way up to West Lake, which was where he left his last entry. Shortly after leaving this entry is when he encountered Paul Wilbur, and so investigators were able to zero in on a 9-mile stretch of the NPT between Cedar Lake and Cedar River flow. Forest rangers and hundreds of volunteers combed this area for weeks, but found no sign of Boomhower. Rangers assumed that Boomhower would stay on the move and try to hike himself to safety, but his ex-wife ended up disagreeing with that assessment. She was quoted in the Albany Times-Union saying, "He would have pitched his tent and waited. He would realize someone would be out there looking for him. And though there were indeed people out there looking for him, none of them were able to locate him." And on July 9th, 1990, the active search for Boomhower was suspended. Investigators would still respond to any new leads or clues, of course, but they would no longer be combing through the woods. However, Boomhower's family continued to search themselves for months after this, unwilling to give up hope that maybe they would find him. But by mid-September, this hope ran out, and they too gave up the search. At this point, I really can't imagine there was much optimism about finding Boomhower alive. On October 20th, 1990, hunting season started in the Adirondacks. A group of hunters headed into the wilderness starting from Louis Lake and hiked west on the Sucker Brook Trail, which runs about 7 to 8 miles from Louis Lake until it intersects with the Northville Placid Trail. The hunters weren't planning on hiking all the way to the NPT, however. They only followed the Sucker Brook Trail for a few miles before turning off the trail, bushwhacking up Mountain. Shortly after departing from the established Sucker Brook Trail, one of the hunters noticed a red United States Postal Service sweatshirt hanging on a stick. He then noticed what looked like an abandoned tent pitched right near the brook. I don't think he thought too much of it at this point, but he did continue up the brook just a short distance, at which point he discovered the decomposed body of David Boomhower lying face down in Sucker Brook. These hunters had accidentally solved a mystery that had frustrated the Adirondack hiking and search and rescue communities for more than 5 months. Now, you'll recall, Boomhower wasn't hiking the Sucker Brook Trail. He was hiking the Northville Placid Trail. And so this finding was initially very confusing. People didn't understand why he had strayed so far from the NPT. He had never mentioned any plans about taking side trails during his thru hike, let alone bushwhacking off of a side trail. However, this question would be answered very quickly because at his campsite, investigators discovered a journal that David Boomhower kept, and it explained exactly what happened. I'm sure this journal did give his family some closure, which is great, but the truth is the details of David Boomhower's final days are nothing short of horrific. Sometime shortly after Boomhower passed Paul Wilbur, he decided that he needed to bail off of the NPT. He was running out of food, he was feeling extremely fatigued and not able to hike at his usual pace, and he didn't think that he could realistically make it to his next resupply point. And so when he reached the intersection between the Northville Placid Trail and the Sucker Brook Trail, he turned and he headed east. He followed the Sucker Brook Trail for about a half mile until he reached Colvin Brook Lean-To. From here, he planned on making the 7-mile trek down the Sucker Brook Trail to the Louis Lake campground on Route 30, where he could hitchhike into civilization and to safety. He wrote in his journal, quote, "Rotten weather and 2 light rations have driven me from the NPT. Am really feeling the effect of inadequate nourishment." He continued down the Sucker Brook Trail for a number of miles, but when he reached the saddle between Cellar and Louis Mountains, Boomhower made a huge mistake. He somehow wandered off of the established trail by accident, and then decided that his best move was to set up camp next to Sucker Brook itself, again, not the trail, and simply wait for rescue. He obviously didn't realize this at the time, but we now know that the campsite he chose was only about a quarter mile away from the Sucker Brook Trail, the trail that if he had continued to follow, would have led him to safety. Boomhower waited and waited and waited, his physical condition deteriorating slowly with each passing day. He made a few attempts to try and relocate the Sucker Brook Trail, but all of these attempts failed because at this point he had grown so physically weak. On June 24th, he wrote in his journal, quote, "Lost day 15. Thought I would try to go down the brook to get to the lake, but not strong enough to go far. This is my last escape effort. Either I'm found here or I die here." By the time of this journal entry, searches were well underway for Boomhower. He even noted in his journal that he noticed a plane flying overhead multiple times, which we now know, by the way, was actually shuttling searchers to Cedar Lake to look for Boomhower. Things were not looking good, and on June 30th, he wrote in his journal, quote, "I wonder if anyone has died out here waiting, believing in that stay calm and help will arrive bullshit." On July 3rd, he wrote, "I'm too weak to save myself. This is a good time to die, but I can't imagine that." The next day, which was the 4th of July, he was actually hoping that he would hear fireworks coming from Louis Lake, which he knew they did every year. If he could hear them, it might help him get his bearings and be able to lead him to safety. But Unfortunately, in 1990, the fireworks at Louis Lake were canceled due to bad weather. As the days and weeks went on, Boomhower really began to lose any hope of being rescued. It also appears that he began to get confused about how long he had been lost for, eventually writing, quote, "I am David Boomhower. I've been lost here 55 days. I can expect no assistance from anyone else. I guess it's a good time to die. I am proud of the way I die, not frightened. Goodbye, Uncle Dave." But it would turn out that this was actually not Boomhower's last journal entry. In fact, it was his second to last. This last entry he made actually seems to give some eerie clues into the state and location that his body was eventually found in. Parts of this entry were not legible. They couldn't make out what he wrote, but we do have some of it, and here it is. Approximately August 3rd. If you unreadable searching, go down the unreadable close to unreadable, which, I mean, I hate to inject my interpretation into this too much. I kind of just want to tell the story, but it kind of seems like he's referring to the river there. If you go down to the river, the brook. P.S. Not likely to get far. Violently ill. Ultimately, investigators believe, based on the state they found his body in, that he must have slipped on a log or something and fell into the brook, eventually dying due to drowning or hypothermia. David Boomhower's story can almost be viewed as a case study in what to or not to do when you're lost in the wilderness. Now, I'm not qualified to give any advice at all when it comes to survival or what you should do in a situation like this, but I do just have to say that when you hear this story, it does raise some questions about the strategy of just simply waiting for rescue when you're lost. I don't know. Either way, it's pretty clear that he was suffering from extreme physical and mental fatigue at the time, and so it does seem like the odds would have probably been against him no matter what he did. Today, a situation like this could be prevented by carrying a satellite device with an SOS button, which I recommend hikers of all skill levels carry. But in 1990, I hadn't even been born yet, so I'm not sure if devices like this existed. I think satellite phones probably did, but I really doubt that many hikers were carrying them. I don't know, but if you're going to take anything away from this, I hope you go out and you buy one of those SOS devices and carry it with you whenever you're hiking. And I also hope that you keep David Boomhower, his friends, and his family in your hearts and in your minds. So for our next story, we're going to be heading out west to Washington State specifically, and I'm going to tell you about one of the most puzzling and frustrating mysteries in the history of the Pacific Crest Trail. And as you can probably imagine, this story is quite disturbing. And so before we get there, I want to make things fun again for just a minute here and tell you about Drink Element. That's right, Drink Element is the sponsor of this video. So do you ever sweat? Let me ask you that. Let's just get real personal. Do you ever sweat? Do you do yard work or hike for that matter, or any kind of exercise? If you do, you need to be replacing your electrolytes, because if you don't, you're gonna get muscle cramps, you're gonna get fatigued. I experienced this on a hike just the other day. I forgot to bring electrolytes, and well, I was kicking myself because Drink Element has sent me so much that I have no excuse. But anyways, it's not enough just to drink a bunch of water. You have to replace those electrolytes to stay hydrated and to stay healthy. And the way that you should do it is with Drink Element. First of all, Drink Element has no BS in it. It's got no sugar. All it has is the electrolytes that you need, your magnesium, your salt, of course, your sodium, potassium. It's got all the good stuff, and it doesn't have any BS. But what it does have is an amazing taste. That's arguably the best part about Element. Grapefruit salt, mango chili if you're feeling a little spicy. They have chocolate salt if you're feeling sweet, but again, no sugar. They're just all so good. I guarantee whatever your palate is, they will have a flavor that you like. And you're gonna get to try pretty much all of them if you go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. Go place a purchase through my link, and when you do that, you're gonna get a sample pack of 8 different flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost, so you can try them all. One more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. They also released this new sparkling water electrolyte drink mix, like a seltzer kind of, and it's so good. So maybe give that a try as well. And thank you so much to Drink Element for continuing to support this content. All right, let's get back to the stories. In September of 2022, I was hiking through the woods of northern Washington on the Pacific Crest Trail. I came upon a beautiful viewpoint right off of a remote dirt road. All of the other hikers I knew were miles behind me, and I was all by myself. As I stopped to take in the view, something caught my eye. It was this. A poster with information about a hiker who had gone missing in the area. These types of posters are unfortunately somewhat common to see at trailheads along well-traveled roads, but this was not a normal trailhead. And the more I've learned about Chris Fowler's disappearance, the more I've realized that this is not a normal disappearance. In 2016, Chris Fowler disappeared in Washington state while through hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. He hiked into the woods, a severe storm came through, and then he was never seen again. When you put the story like that, it sounds like a pretty straightforward disappearance. However, the more I've researched into this story, including extensive conversations with Chris's stepmother Sally, the more I've come to the conclusion that things just don't add up to me. I'm not here to push any particular theories. I'm not here to even try and solve this case. I'm just here to simply tell Chris Fowler's story, and along the way, ask some important questions and cover some important details that I personally feel have been overlooked by the media when they were covering Chris's case. In the spring of 2016, Chris Sherpa, which was his trail name, Fowler, set out to through hike the Pacific Crest Trail, which runs over 2,600 miles from the Mexican border through California, Oregon, and Washington, all the way to the Canadian border. A lot of you watching probably know that I attempted to through hike the Pacific Crest Trail this past year in 2022. I did most of it, but I didn't finish, so I can tell you firsthand how difficult of a feat a through hike like this is. And despite the difficulty, Chris made it all the way to central Washington by mid-October in 2016, leaving less than 400 miles left until he finished the hike at the Canadian border. On October 12th, the last confirmed sighting of Chris happened at the Cracker Barrel store near White's Pass. And this is a very common spot for PCT hikers to send packages of supplies because it's literally right off of the trail. I sent a box there when I hiked through in 2022. When Chris left the Cracker Barrel store, it's assumed that he was heading back onto the trail to continue hiking north. However, there was a severe storm approaching, and according to reports, most other hikers in the area had decided to leave the trail in order to avoid this storm. In fact, some of the last hikers that Chris spoke to indicated that he was kind of debating, going back and forth about whether he wanted to hike out into the storm or whether he wanted to get off the trail like a lot of other hikers were doing. Ultimately, Chris decided to continue hiking, and after he left White Pass, he was never confirmed to have been seen again. About an hour after he left, his cell phone was pinged from a nearby tower for the last time. This means that he most likely turned his cell phone off for reasons that we don't know, but it's not unheard of for hikers to turn their cell phones off because they want to preserve battery. That evening, the storm rolled in, bringing heavy rain, wind, and even some snow at the higher elevations in the area. And about a week later, Chris's family, they became concerned and they contacted the authorities. A massive search was conducted spanning across multiple agencies and counties in the state of Washington. Though much of the PCT in Washington was searched, it seems as though the most likely area that Chris had disappeared from was the 28-mile stretch of trail from White Pass, where he was last seen, north to Chinook Pass at Highway 410. I honestly don't know the correct pronunciation. Is it Chinook? Chinook? My understanding is that they focused on this area because if Chris had made it all the way to Chinook Pass, he almost certainly would have used the road there to bail into town and seek refuge. And as someone who has through hiked thousands of miles on the PCT and lots of other long distance trails, this absolutely makes sense to me. If you're out there and you get hit with like a storm that's bigger than expected and it really, beats the crap out of you, you're probably going to be soaked, exhausted, and cold. And if you have a chance to cross a road and bail into town, you're going to take that opportunity. Despite the authorities extensively searching the area for weeks on foot and also using helicopters, no sign of Chris was ever found. And this is where I need to start raising a few questions. First of all, since Chris was through hiking, he almost certainly would have been sticking to the PCT or at the very least other established trails in the area. I really highly doubt he would have been purposely going off trail. This means that if he did succumb to the elements during the storm, how is it that his body wasn't recovered on or very close to the PCT? I'm just surprised that nobody found him, honestly. And obviously a major storm definitely complicates things. Like maybe he became disorientated, or maybe he lost the trail because of low visibility or something. This is definitely possible, but still the PCT is very well traveled and very well marked. I mean, the trail is very wide. It's hard to miss. So again, if there's a storm, you never know what can happen, but I don't know. It just seems bizarre to me. And here's another question. What happened to all of Chris Fowler's gear? Chris was known to be carrying a green Thermarest Z-Lite sleeping pad, a bright blue tarp, a big Agnes Fairview 1 tent, which is a very large tent, by the way. It definitely would have stuck out if it was set up close to the trail, a black and orange ULA backpack, among many other pieces of backpacking gear. And interestingly enough, Chris was also carrying a Spot GPS device, which has an SOS button on it, but unfortunately, he had not activated the subscription service to the GPS device, which meant he was unable to use it and unable to call for help. None of his gear has ever been recovered, which I just think is super bizarre. Every year since his disappearance in 2016, hundreds of thru hikers would have hiked through that exact area he went missing. And that's just the thru hikers. There's also gonna be hundreds of day hikers, weekend backpackers, and section hikers. And despite all of this foot traffic going through that area, none of his gear has ever been found. And here's the clinker. There are some possible explanations as to why this is the case. There have been 3 unconfirmed sightings of Chris outside of the section of trail that he went missing on, that section from White Pass to Chinook Pass. And the interesting thing about these unconfirmed sightings is that 2 of them have been given little to almost no coverage by the media, despite being of interest to Chris's family. And one thing I want to say here is that I know a decent amount of people watch my channel that will be on the PCT either next year or sometime in the future. So if that's you, just please keep an eye out for any random gear on the side of the trail or near the trail when you're hiking north of White Pass. And if you do find something, Chris's stepmother, Sally, has very specific instructions for what she wants you to do. I spoke with her about this. She asked that you stand directly over the items, take pictures, and get the coordinates of the location. Also, take photos of the surrounding areas and contact her. You can do that through this Facebook group I have on the screen right now. I will also have a link to it in the description of the video. So back to these unconfirmed sightings of Chris. I read through almost every news article I could find about his disappearance while researching for this video, and in all of those articles, I only found 1 unconfirmed sighting of Chris that was consistently reported on. And so when I started to chat with Sally, Chris's stepmother, in order to get more information for the video, I was really surprised to learn that there's actually 2 more unconfirmed sightings of Chris that have received very, very little attention from the media. The sighting that did get some attention was by 2 hunters who supposedly spoke with Chris near Blowout Mountain on October 22nd. Blowout Mountain is about 60 miles north of White Pass, where Chris was last seen. Despite this unconfirmed sighting, there have been a lot of inconsistencies in these hunters' story, so most sources don't really consider this sighting to be credible, and that includes Chris's stepmother, Sally. The next unconfirmed potential sighting happened in the town of Greenwater, Washington. According to Sally, a bartender at the Greenwater Tavern said a man came in on around October 13th or October 14th, looking wet and tired, and gave the trail name Sherpa. Again, that was Chris's trail name. The bartender offered him a free meal, but he turned her down. And when the bartender went into the back room, the man left the restaurant, and that was the end of it. Obviously, there's no way to confirm that the man in the bar was in fact Chris, but the bartender has never wavered from her story. And the timeline of this also checks out because Greenwater can be accessed from Chinook Pass, and it makes sense that Chris could have been there only a day or 2 after leaving White Pass. The last unconfirmed potential sighting of Chris happened in the town of Mazama, Washington, around October 15th. Again, I think Mazama is how you say that. I'm not exactly sure, so bear with me. This town is much further north than White Pass. It's very close to the end of the PCT near the Canadian border. According to an employee at the Mazama store who was interviewed by Chris's stepmother, Sally, a man came into the store, and while he was making a purchase, he exchanged trail names with that employee and gave the trail name Sherpa. In addition to this, it's known that Chris shipped a resupply box to another store in Mazama, and that store is called Goat's Beard, and this box was never found at the store after Chris went missing. This means that it was either lost by the store, it was picked up by Chris, which would confirm that he was there, or it was never sent. Unfortunately, the store did not keep records of which boxes were getting picked up and, keeping track of people's names and stuff. So there's really no way to verify which of those three options is correct. So this sighting would seem somewhat credible, but unfortunately there are a few pieces of evidence kind of working against it as well. Supposedly when Chris was at that first store, there were some other hikers there that he was speaking to. This is all according to that employee once again. But all of those hikers were later interviewed and none of them remembered talking to Chris or any other hiker. Another thing to note here is that because Mazama is pretty far away from White Pass, it just seems unlikely that he would have, basically impossible, that he would have been able to make it all the way up there by October 15th. However, when I was talking with Sally, she told me that Chris had been known to hitchhike, and so it's definitely possible that he got a ride further north in order to go and finish that last section of the trail before the season ended, before it got too cold and snowy. I want to once again reiterate that neither the Greenwater or the Mazama potential sightings are confirmed. And in addition to that, there was no activity on Chris's cell phone or his credit card in either one of those areas after he disappeared. My understanding is that both of these unconfirmed sightings were investigated by the authorities at the time, but they were ultimately ruled as unreliable. But it's just strange to me that the unconfirmed sighting by the hunters was pretty largely talked about in the news, but these other two unconfirmed sightings, which seem to be a little bit more credible than that first one, have mostly been ignored. And there's just so many unanswered questions about what happened to Chris Fowler. Why hasn't his gear been recovered? Despite the storm coming through, I'm sure there were still some other hikers on the trail, so how was he not seen by anybody after he left White Pass? And ultimately, the big question is, what could have possibly happened to him? As of today, we may not know the answer to that question. But I am confident that Chris will be discovered someday soon. And this is largely due to the efforts of the Fowler O'Sullivan Foundation, which was formed by a lady named Kathy Tarr and the families of Chris Fowler and David O'Sullivan, who is another hiker who went missing on the PCT. The Fowler O'Sullivan Foundation is continuing the efforts to find both hikers, help families of other missing hikers, and providing information and resources for hikers to stay safe on the trail. I think this is really awesome. They actually give away Garmin InReach GPS devices to future PCT hikers. And so I want to encourage everybody watching this video to go to fofound.org and read more about their work, and honestly consider making a donation. One more time, that's fofound.org, and I also have a link to the website in the description. And I also want to say a special thank you to Sally Fowler, because she gave me so much information when I was researching this case. She answered every single question that I had, even some very tedious small details, and I'm so greatly appreciative of that. I really hope that Chris's family gets some answers very soon about what happened to him. In May of 2016, thru hiker Ian Crombie was stumbling through the snow in northern New Mexico on the Continental Divide Trail, or CDT for short. He was hiking northbound, and he was very early in the season. So early, in fact, that he was about to make an important discovery and solve a mystery that had dumbfounded the New Mexico authorities since the previous winter. He found his way into a remote U.S. Forest Service campground, and he was probably looking forward to some of the luxuries it provided over a normal backcountry campsite, like a vault toilet, for instance. But unfortunately for him, he would not be able to use this toilet, because what he found scratched into the door probably sent chills up his spine. It read, "Dead CDT hiker inside, call cops, not a joke." And as fate would have it, the man inside the bathroom was named Stephen Olshansky, and he also went by the trail name Otter. This is the story of how Otter lived and unfortunately died through what has to be every hiker's worst nightmare. I'm just gonna come out and say it right now. This story is This seriously might be one of the most disturbing stories in thru hiking history, and it honestly blows my mind that despite the fact that I've been thru hiking for so many years now, I had never heard it until a few commenters pointed it out. So thank you very much to everyone who did that. In 2015, 59-year-old Stephen Olshansky, trail name Otter, set out on a southbound thru hike of the Continental Divide Trail, which is roughly 3,000 miles in length, and it spans the length of the United States from Mexico to Canada, running through the heart of the Rocky Mountains. The CDT is part of the Triple Crown of hiking, which also includes the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail. Completing all three trails is a huge deal within the hiking community, and Otter was one of the few to have actually accomplished that incredibly difficult feat. But Otter wasn't just a Triple Crowner. Otter had actually hiked all three of the Triple Crown trails multiple times, which is just insane. Like, this legitimately makes Otter one of the most accomplished and experienced thru hikers in history. He was clearly not just some schmuck who didn't know what he was doing, went out on a hike and died as a result. No, Otter had way more experience than probably anyone who will watch this video. By mid-November 2015, Otter was about to cross the Colorado/New Mexico border and enter the final state of his thru hike. He also must have known that the timing of his thru hike was really pushing it. By November, it's not uncommon at all to have severe snowstorms in the mountains in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. Now, I haven't hiked the CDT, but I do know that by this time of year, mid-November, it's pretty rare for thru hikers to still be that far north on the trail. It's reported that Otter spent a few days at the home of some trail angels, Ben and Jill Whitting, in Chama, New Mexico, where they actually discussed some impending snowstorms, and Otter even tested out some new winter gear while he was staying with them in town. Now, I wasn't there, obviously, I never knew Otter, but it does seem to me, from all the information I was able to gather, that Otter knew it was definitely possible the weather could get dicey when he hiked out of Chama. And despite this, he decided to hike out anyways. On November 14th, 2015, he was dropped off at Cumbers Pass in Colorado. This would be the last time that he was ever seen alive. The day that he left Cumbers Pass, Otter realized that he was in big trouble. At the time, he was keeping a journal, and he was also recording periodic videos on his cell phone to upload to YouTube. In his journal and to his camera, Otter explained how the snowy conditions had been much more severe than he was expecting, and his body was having a really hard time handling it. He wrote, quote, "I immediately began to suffer from terrible weakness. When I stood up, I felt faint. The snow was waist deep in places. I saw one spot of ground, and I took it and pitched," his tent presumably. It started snowing, ending Tuesday, November 17th, late, well over a foot on top. This campsite that Otter was referring to here was roughly 12 miles away from Cumbers Pass, where he had started. My understanding is that he rode out the storm in that campsite, and then the day after the snow stopped, he tried to backtrack and get back to Cumbers Pass to bail out. However, his body was feeling so weak at this point, he could hardly even make it a mile, and so he ended up actually turning around and going back to his campsite because he knew the campsite was very well protected and it also had plenty of firewood. This meant that Otter was stuck. He might have been in a temporarily safe spot, but he was stuck, and he had no GPS device, no spot, no cell signal. He had no way to call for help. It's at this point that Otter pulled out his cell phone and used some of what was left of his dwindling phone battery to tell the world about his dicey predicament. I can't play the video on here, unfortunately, because I don't want to risk getting a copyright strike, but I will show some screenshots, and I will quote from the video and tell you what Otter said. Otter sighs and says, quote, "I'm in big trouble. I'm snowbound. I tried to hike out yesterday. It's about 10 to 12 miles back on the road, and I can't make it." Now, by this point, I'm sure there's a lot of you wondering, how is it that a man with such vast experience made the decision to hike out when the conditions were so bad and so dangerous? I can't answer that question for sure, but I can tell you in the next part of Otter's video, he clearly regrets his decision and he owns up to it. He says, quote, "Let me just say up front, I made a huge mistake. I should have turned back or never come out here this time of year. I really rolled the dice and I lost. Otter then goes on to explain what he's doing to keep himself alive. He talks about his choice of campsite selection, how much firewood he has, and about how he was actually camped right next to Forest Service Road 87, and he hoped that because of this, a random snowmobiler would come through and would be able to alert people that he needed rescue. He then turns his attention to a totally different avenue of potential rescue. Quoting from the video once again, "There's one guy, Ben Whitting. He's the only guy who really knows where I am, and when I walked out the door, he said, 'Otter, you got 10 days. 10 days, if I don't hear from you, we're gonna come looking for you. And he better be a fucking man of his word. If he doesn't do that, I am absolutely toast.'" Unfortunately, it would be longer than 10 days before Whitting would sound the alarms about Otter. But eventually, on November 29th, Whitting did start asking around online to see if anybody had heard from Otter, and shortly after realized nobody had, and the authorities were contacted. In the meantime, however, Otter remained stuck. He spelled out the word "help" on the ground, hoping that it would be spotted by a plane. He fashioned some homemade snowshoes made out of branches from the surrounding campsite, and he remained huddled inside of his tent as another severe snowstorm came through. He waited like this until December 1st, and with still no sign of rescue in sight, he decided that he needed to do something else. At this point, his phone was 100% dead, and he was not carrying a paper map. However, before his phone had died, he remembered seeing a campground on his GPS app that was about 3 miles away from him down Forest Service Road 87. It was the Lagunitas campground, and Otter had slept in its bathroom once before on a previous hike. Now that might sound ridiculous to some of you, but I do just want to have a little aside here. Sleeping in bathrooms at Forest Service campgrounds is actually fairly common for thru hikers to do, especially when the weather is bad. Ultimately, Otter decided that instead of continuing to wait in his current campsite, he was going to head for Lagunitas campground. He wrote in his journal, quote, "Took a lot of courage to pack up that day. I hiked 200 yards and bent over from total exhaustion in the waist-deep snow. I looked back to the place where I had spent 17 days, safe, but a coffin. A few steps, bend over, it took all day. I could not go one step further and was about to just sleep in the snow, and I looked to my left and saw the bathroom. I squeezed inside the icebox shivering, got into my sleeping bag, cranked up the wood stove for a hot drink." In the meantime, the search for Otter was finally getting started. It was known that his next intended destination after he left Cumbres Pass was Ghost Ranch, where he had shipped a resupply box. According to the employees at Ghost Ranch, Otter had not yet picked up his box, indicating that he had either not made it that far or he had just not been there, even though he was planning on it. On December 10th, an aerial search for Otter was conducted. Multiple planes searched 300 square miles of Carson National Forest between Chama and Ghost Ranch, the section of the CDT that Otter had been hiking. Unfortunately, the winter conditions at the time made it pretty much impossible for the searchers to spot anybody on the ground, and thus no discoveries were made. And coincidentally, that exact same day, December 10th, 2015, a potential sighting of Otter threw the search into a whole new direction. A ranger in Grants, New Mexico, another CDT town about 200 miles southwest of Chama, thought that he spotted Otter at the Forest Service station in town. The ranger did not ask the man what his name was, but he had seen flyers of Otter and thought it was the same person. A few other people in town also had recognized the man, and this brought some relief to the searchers, thinking that maybe Otter was still just making his way south along the trail. But this didn't really make sense to Otter's friends and family. The ranger who supposedly spoke to Otter had said the man asked for directions to the post office. But as we've established, Otter had already hiked the CDT multiple times, he had been to Grants multiple times, and so he already knew where the post office was. In addition, the ranger described this man as, quote, evasive, which was pretty much the polar opposite of what Otter was like. He was described as very social and outgoing by his friends. I'm not exactly sure why, but it seems like this potential sighting in Grants, as well as a few other potential sightings in different towns along the CDT, caused the official search to pretty much stop, much to the horror of Otter's friends and family. And what's just as horrifying is that on December 10th, when they were searching with the planes, like I mentioned a minute ago, they were this close to finding Otter. On this day, Otter decided that he was done waiting for rescue once again, and he was going to try to make his way out. He had burnt down a wooden shed at the campground, hoping that someone would notice the fire, and he now used pieces of the metal roof to create a pair of makeshift skis. He started skiing away from the campground, and he didn't make it very far before he spotted a potential chance at salvation. He wrote in his journal, once again quoting, "Just as I was at the end of the entrance road, along comes search and rescue plane directly above me, and I was out in the open. They flew over the campground and might have seen the building I burnt down after the storm because it was not snow covered. A couple of minutes later, they turned around and flew back over, wildly waving at them. They had a perfect view as I was out in the open. My only chance left is that they saw me." But unfortunately, the planes had not spotted Otter. He eventually returned to the campground, having not made it very far on the skis, and he wrote, "My gut says they didn't see me. If they don't show up, I'm doomed. It's all come down to this." At the campground, Otter found a large stash of horse feed, and he was able to use it to make a rudimentary version of oatmeal. He stayed in that bathroom waiting and waiting, but no rescue ever came. And by December 17th, it appears as though Otter had given up any hope of being saved, either by rescuers or by himself. He began to take preparations to end his own life, writing in his journal, "My intention is to bring the stove inside later and asphyxiate myself. Probably won't work. Nothing else I've tried has. I intend to enjoy my last day, eat my remaining food, stay warm, and focus on the beauty and good things that were my life, especially my friends." He tried to follow through, but as he predicted, it didn't work. The bathroom was not airtight. He waited for a few more weeks, and by sometime in January, he once again tried to end his life, this time cutting himself with a saw, but this too failed. And it seems like he changed his mind after this attempt, and he continued to wait. In his final days, Otter journaled about his life. He recalled pleasant memories from his time on the trail, and he also expressed some regret about consuming large amounts of marijuana shortly before he set out from Cumbres Pass. He wrote, quote, "I was so stoned on cookies, weed, etc. in Chama, I went on anyway." He wrote about how he did not blame anyone else but himself for what had happened. "This is a situation of my own doing from a life that I led." Eventually, sometime in mid to late January, Otter finally passed away from hypothermia, compounded by starvation and dehydration. He had been at the lower Lagunitas campground for 4 to 6 weeks and had spent just over 2 additional weeks camped out at his original campsite. And for the coming months, still nobody knew what had happened to Otter. It was pretty much like he had vanished. That was until May of 2016. On May 10th, 2016, CDT thru hiker Ian Crombie approached the Lagunitas campground. He was really early in the thru hiker season, and he had been post-holing through snow for the past 30 miles. When he finally reached the campground, he noticed a pair of homemade skis sitting up against the bathroom. His attention then turned towards the door of the bathroom, and this is where things got serious. Scratched into the door of the bathroom was a warning about a dead CDT hiker. There was also a paper note that was stuck to the door which read, "There is a dead human body inside bathroom locked in. It is that of Stephen Olshansky, aka the Otter. Please notify authorities immediately. No joke. Thank you." Crombie was well aware of who Otter was because he had seen missing person flyers for him in pretty much every town along the CDT thus far. Crombie hiked out immediately. He could not get inside the bathroom because it was locked, and a few days later, he reached Chama and he alerted the police. It was no easy task for investigators to make it out to Lagunitas campground. Once again, it was the spring, there was still really bad snow conditions, but eventually through a combination of ATVs, side-by-sides, and just good old-fashioned hiking, the investigators were able to make it to the campground and recover Otter's body and his journal. And finally, the hiking community, as well as Otter's friends and family, finally had some answers about what had happened. Once again, Stephen Otter Olshansky was an extremely experienced hiker, one of the most accomplished thru hikers in history. But despite all of that experience, he still made a tragic and fatal mistake on November 14th, 2015. And again, according to himself in his journal and videos, he should have never hiked out that day. I really think that every single thru hiker and prospective thru hiker needs to hear this story. It's a harrowing reminder that you should never get too comfortable with your abilities in the mountains, even if you're at an elite level of experience. It's really one of the saddest and most disturbing stories about a thru hiker that I've ever heard. Once again, I can't believe that I had never heard of this story until just a few weeks ago. My heart goes out to Otter and his friends, everyone he knew within the hiking community, and of course, his family. This story has really stuck with me, and I'm thinking about maybe doing another video where I go through some of the lessons and takeaways from what happened to Otter, because once again, he himself even acknowledged that the situation could have been prevented. So please leave a comment and let me know what some of the biggest lessons from this story are. Photos like this one right here made Gigi Wu the most famous hiker in all of Taiwan. She had managed to carve out a unique and somewhat controversial niche for herself on social media, routinely posting photos of herself on top of mountains wearing nothing but a bikini. The more of these photos that she posted, the more followers that she would gain. Hundreds of followers quickly turned into thousands, and before she knew it, Gigi Wu's body had been viewed by so many people that it's almost disturbing to comprehend. But that's just my opinion. Wu herself clearly didn't care. After all, she was doing what she loved. She was using her platform to inspire body confidence and to provide valuable updates and information about the trails that she was hiking. Every time that she posed on a mountain, thousands and thousands of people would be touched, and while she did remain humble about this, there's also no doubt that she enjoyed it. Gigi Wu was figuratively and somewhat literally on top of the world. But unfortunately, that would all come crashing down in January of 2019. Media outlets learned that Taiwan's most beloved hiker had not only died, but had died from hypothermia of all things. Headlines such as "Woman known as bikini hiker freezes to death on mountain" quickly spread all over social media, and this created a wave of backlash and hate against Gigi Wu. That seems like the natural conclusion to hiking in a bikini, honestly. As long as her tits looked good on Instagram, I'm sure it's how she would have wanted to go. She hit bikini bottom. So sad that she risked her life to get likes. I think those 4 comments sum up pretty well what the online reaction was after the story of Gigi Wu's death broke in the media. But do these comments actually reflect the truth about Gigi Wu? Is it actually accurate to say that she put herself in danger and ended up dying in the process just to get clout on social media? Was she truly just some ignorant and reckless social media influencer with no knowledge about backcountry travel, as a lot of these online commenters proclaimed? The truth about Gigi Wu is much more complicated than the clickbait headlines about a bikini hiker freezing to death made it sound. In fact, as Wu's fans and online defenders will quickly point out, she wasn't even wearing a bikini when she died. With that said, and putting the haters and trolls aside for a minute, there are still some legitimate questions about Gigi Wu's death, and I don't want you to get me wrong about that. Was she properly prepared for the hike that she was undertaking? Was a solo hike in her chosen area the type of decision that a safe hiker would have made? And finally, did her social media stardom contribute to her death in any way? I'll attempt to answer these questions and more in today's video. This is the full story, the truth about Gigi Wu, the bikini hiker. Folks, if you couldn't tell already, this is gonna be a controversial one, and I say that for a few different reasons. First of all, this story has launched a debate about risk-taking and gear choices in the outdoors, and second of all, obviously the nature of Gigi Wu's photos, or her social media brand for the lack of a better term, is also very controversial. These two topics are completely different, but they're also loosely related in this story, and so make sure you watch all the way to the end of the video because it's probably gonna take a while for me to kind of pull everything together. So at some point in the early 2010s, Gigi Wu, she lost a bet. The Taiwanese woman had recently begun working on a peak bagging list called the 100 Peaks of Taiwan, which, as the name implies, is a list of 100 peaks above 3,000 meters or 9,800-ish feet tall. Now, I'm a peak bagger myself. I haven't hiked in Taiwan, but these peak bagging lists are common all over the world and definitely here in the US as well. The Colorado 14ers or the Adirondack 46ers. These are some popular ones. Basically, the idea is that you take the list and then you hike each peak, checking them off one by one as you do them until you've conquered the entire list. Tons of people, myself included, love peak bagging because it's like a fun but goal-oriented way to get yourself out into the mountains. For Gigi Wu, there was actually an extra challenge when it came to her journey to conquer the 100 peaks of Taiwan. She had actually, again, lost a bet to a friend, and her punishment, you could say, was that she had to pose for a photo in a bikini when she summited her next mountain. Now, the details of this bet aren't known to me, but one way or another, this photo that she had to take as her punishment would end up on Gigi's Facebook page, and it would unsurprisingly end up attracting some attention. One thing led to another, and posing in a bikini quickly became a regular part of Gigi Wu's mountaintop routine, and it's unclear to me exactly why, beyond just the bet at least. Now, those of you that are more cynical might assume that it was being done out of vanity and that Gigi enjoyed the compliments and the attention that she was getting on Facebook about her body. And this is a totally reasonable assumption, but according to those who actually knew her in person, her mission with her Facebook photos was actually much deeper than just flexing her attractive figure. We're gonna talk about that a little bit later in the video, but regardless of what her intentions were, with every new bikini photo that she posted, Gigi Wu's likes, her shares, and her followers obviously went up. And well, they went up fast. In July of 2016, Gigi Wu reached the top of her final peak, having officially conquered the 100 peaks of Taiwan. And at this point, she'd been doing it for a few years and had gathered quite the following on social media, and she was definitely becoming a very well-known figure within the Taiwanese hiking community. Now, I can speak from experience here. Anytime you get past a certain number of followers or views or whatever, you're gonna get some haters, you're gonna have some detractors. This was definitely the case with Gigi Wu, but I'd be willing to bet that most of these people were just jealous. I mean, at this point, it was becoming very difficult, if not impossible, for anyone to argue that Gigi Wu was only seeking praise and attention for her body. And I say that because, I mean, after all, if vanity was her only motivation at all, then why was she going through the effort of climbing all these peaks, pushing herself physically, mentally, taking the time and spending the money to travel around to these different mountains? I mean, she could have easily just posted up at one of Taiwan's many beaches, snapped a few bikini photos there, and probably gotten the same amount of attention. She also would routinely post photos of the scenery that she encountered on her hikes without her or her bikinis in the photos at all. And so clearly there was something else that was driving her beyond just the attention to her body. Those that knew Gigi Wu personally came to realize that she was using her platform to serve and to grow Taiwan's hiking community. Write-ups that detailed her routes and also the potential hazards of the trails that she hiked would accompany her provocative photos on Facebook. These write-ups and these details were the type of information that was incredibly useful and even invaluable for future hikers that were going to be attempting the same routes as she was. Now, could she have posted this helpful information without the addition of the bikini photos? Well, of course she could have done that, but would it have reached and thus helped nearly as many potential hikers? The answer to that is an obvious no. Don't get me wrong, I'm not arguing that the only reason she was doing this was to help other hikers either. I'm sure that she did enjoy the attention, but I'm just trying to illustrate here that the attention and the compliments on her body and stuff certainly was not the only driving factor for Gigi Wu. By the time that she had finished the 100 peaks of Taiwan, she had gathered so much hiking experience that she was actually feeling perfectly comfortable taking solo trips through the mountains, which is something that I'm sure she never would have considered possible when she was just a beginner, a novice hiker. And on the topic of solo hiking, creating these YouTube videos, telling these stories for you guys has definitely taught me just how controversial solo hiking is. I mean, of course, I always knew that hiking by yourself is going to be more dangerous than hiking in a group, but the truth is that a lot of experienced hikers, myself included, hike solo, and this is done for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes you want to take a route that doesn't interest any of your friends or hike a mountain they're not interested in. Sometimes your hiking friends don't have the same physical abilities as you. Sometimes these friends just aren't available to go hiking at all. And it's also worth saying that enjoying the mountains with like total solitude, nobody else around, is also fun and very rewarding. And so, yes, there is added risk that comes with solo hiking, but for those of us that really like getting out there on a regular basis, a lot of the time it's either hike solo or you just don't hike at all. And based on the progression of Gigi's hiking experience and her skill level, I'm guessing, it's an assumption, but I'm guessing that she felt the same way as I do. With all that said, the risk factor of each individual hiking trail is different, and so hiking solo on a trail that's relatively safe is not the same, in my opinion, as hiking solo on a trail that's a lot more dangerous. Like, there is a limit that I would feel comfortable with. Like, there's a lot of trails that I would not hike solo, and there's a lot of trails that I would feel totally fine with it, and like I said, I do it fairly regularly. I've never been to Taiwan. I'd love to go someday, but I've never been there, let alone actually hiked there, so I'm not gonna pretend like I know exactly what the trails are like there and the conditions and stuff. Actually, if you've hiked in Taiwan, please leave a comment and enlighten us. But with that said, I did do some research on trail conditions in Taiwan, and I did this because, well, I know here in the United States just how wildly they can vary even within the same regions. Again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but my loose understanding is that back in the 2010s, there were many unofficial trails in Taiwan. These trails that would receive some foot traffic, but they were technically closed and off limits. My assumption is that these trails would almost certainly be like unmaintained. They're probably very remote, and because of these factors, they're probably more dangerous than the small amount of official trails in the country. Again, I could be totally wrong, but that's kind of what I took away from my research. And I also learned that Gigi Wu was one of the many hikers who would frequently hike on these unofficial, I guess, illegal trails. Now, even though Gigi Wu had finished her original peak bagging goal, she didn't stop hiking. And she also didn't stop posting her mountaintop bikini photos either. If anything, it was actually quite the opposite. It's reported that by 2018, she was spending just as much time in the mountains as she was in her own home, which was a trend that I'm sure she planned on continuing into the year 2019. But unfortunately, this wouldn't materialize because 2019 was a year that was cut very short for Gigi Wu. On January 11th, 2019, Gigi Wu began what was supposed to be a 2-week backpacking trip through Yushan National Park, and she was gonna do this trip completely solo. Her plan was to essentially make a giant loop through the mountains, starting and ending at the Dongpu Hot Springs. She started off on one of these official and marked trails, and she actually followed that for the first few days of her trip. But then, on January 19th, Gigi reached a critical trail intersection. It was actually here that she left the official trail, and she began hiking on one of those unofficial, unmaintained trails through the park. Again, I haven't hiked in Taiwan, but I'm assuming that the conditions on this trail would have been very difficult. From what I've been able to tell through researching, the trail was incredibly steep. It had these really steep climbs and descents over like uneven, loose terrain. It would have been wet, it would have been muddy, and it definitely would have been slippery. This is the type of trail that a beginner hiker, a novice, would want to avoid at all costs. But as we've established, Gigi Wu was far from a novice hiker at this point. This is going to be an assumption here, but I'm almost certain that she would have encountered similar, if not even more dangerous trail conditions on some of her previous hikes. Probably more times than we can even count, to be honest. Yes, this type of hiking is dangerous, especially solo, but at the end of the day, if anyone was going to be capable of doing it, it was Gigi Wu. All that she had to do was to trust her experience and control her movements safely. With that said, one of the things that was out of Gigi's control was the weather. Bad weather can put even the strongest of hikers in extreme danger, especially when this weather is unexpected and not anticipated. That is exactly what happened to Gigi Wu on the afternoon of January 19th. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that she didn't pay attention to the weather forecasts. It's actually known that she did check weather reports in the area prior to leaving and while she was on her trip. So it's not like she just set out with no research on weather whatsoever. But as many of you watching this probably know from experience, the weather in the mountains can be incredibly volatile. And even though the forecast says that it's going to be clear, that can often fail to materialize. So on January 19th, Gigi Wu messaged a friend around noon, and she reported her condition and her plans for the rest of the day. At this point, she was roughly 8,000 feet in elevation, or around 2,400 meters, and she planned on descending about 300 feet before finally setting up camp for that day. She actually planned on checking in with the same friend again once she was like safe and in her tent, but instead, the next contact that Gigi Wu made with the outside world was much more disturbing. At 4:30 p.m., one of Gigi's friends, who was also an experienced hiker himself, received a desperate call from her. Now, she was calling from a satellite phone, and she told her friend, through a broken connection by the way, that she had fallen down a cliff, couldn't move her legs at all, and that she needed help. She managed to tell her friend which unofficial trail that she was traveling on, and after this, the call went completely dead. In total, this call lasted for no longer than 30 seconds. So obviously this was very worrying for Gigi's friend, and he wasn't just worried about her legs and her physical injuries, by the way. He was very worried about the temperatures that she was likely to experience that night. Now, this friend had spent enough time in the mountains himself to know that if Gigi was wet and she was unable to shelter herself and warm herself up, hypothermia would be a very real and very serious concern. And so this friend alerted the authorities at the national park, and he also repeatedly tried to call and text Gigi back in order to get more information. And despite doing this over and over and over, despite these stubborn efforts, he was never able to get through to her again. This meant that Gigi's initial 30-second call for help would end up being the last time that she was ever heard from alive. Now, even though Gigi's dire situation had been reported pretty quickly, the difficult weather conditions, likely the same conditions that led to her falling in the first place, made it impossible for a rescue to be mounted that first evening when they found out that she was in trouble. And so she had to spend the night, and then by the morning, the weather wasn't much better. And though they had helicopters ready to go, they were on standby, the conditions just still wouldn't allow for it. In the meantime, a few rescuers did set out on foot into the mountains that morning. Even though they had like the rough coordinates of where Gigi was, it would end up taking almost 2 days for searchers to finally locate her. And that should tell you just how remote and inaccessible her final resting place was. Eventually, searchers were able to spot what they thought was her and her gear on the evening of January 20th. But at this point, night was fast approaching, and just because of how difficult it was to move around in this terrain, they decided that they had to wait. And thus, it wasn't until noon on the 21st of January that they finally reached Gigi Wu. And tragically, also unsurprisingly, at this point, she had already passed. The initial reason for why she fell has never been determined. It probably won't ever be, but it was determined that she fell roughly 65 feet down into a ravine, and it's at that point that she made the initial call for help. Her condition would have deteriorated quite quickly, and due to the fact that she was unable to move around very well, she couldn't set up her tent, and because she wasn't sheltered, hypothermia would have set in pretty quickly. Her jacket was actually found laying next to her, which might seem odd to you at first, but one thing that I've actually learned since I started making these videos is that people who are suffering from the advanced stages of hypothermia often feel this false sense of warmth and end up shedding their layers before ultimately falling into a coma and passing away. It appears that this is what happened to Gigi Wu, and I do want to note that it's frustrating that the rescuers couldn't reach her more quickly and reach her in time to save her, but I'm not trying to criticize them for this, and I don't really think it's fair for anybody to criticize them. Remember, she was hiking off an official trail in a very remote and treacherous area during a spell of bad weather. I mean, I think these rescuers reached her as fast as they possibly could without putting themselves in too much danger. It took a few more days for Gigi Wu's body to finally be removed, and by the time it had, the story of her death was making headlines all around Taiwan and all around the world. Actually, let me correct that. A version of her story was making headlines, and many of these headlines, by the way, were not false, but very misleading, to put it mildly. In fact, let me read a few of them to you right now. From Vice News, woman known as bikini hiker freezes to death on mountain. From The Week, bikini hiker freezes to death after mountain fall. And from Global News, quote, bikini climber Gigi Wu dies in the cold after hiking accident in Taiwan mountains. Many other outlets published similar headlines, all of which clearly imply that Gigi Wu had froze to death because, or at the very least, while she was wearing a bikini. And the problem with these headlines was that's not what happened. Gigi Wu was not wearing a bikini when she fell, and she was not wearing a bikini when she ultimately died of hypothermia. She was found wearing completely normal, appropriate clothing for someone who was hiking in the mountains. Those that knew her and had hiked with her attested to the fact that she would never actually hike in her bikini. She would hike up the mountain in normal clothing and then change into the bikini once she was ready for her photo shoot on top of the mountain. Now, due to these headlines and also due to the fact that she was popular on social media, a lot of sarcasm and sometimes just straight up hate was thrown at Gigi Wu in the aftermath of her death. Even those who understood that she wasn't wearing a bikini when she died still criticized her, saying that she only attempted her hikes because she wanted to be famous and get attention. Other people suggested that she was just another one of those social media influencers who was taking extreme risks so they could get likes and clout and online validation, even though she had no business being out there. Now, as I established earlier in the video, those claims were completely false. That was not Gigi Wu's purpose, and I think it's very unfair to characterize her in this way. She was obviously a lot more than just a pretty girl in a bikini. She was an extremely experienced and accomplished hiker who had inspired thousands of other hikers over the years that led up to her death. Her love for the mountains ran so deep that I'm almost 100% certain that she would have been out there doing all of these hikes regardless of if she had 14,000 followers on Facebook or if she had just one follower. But while I do think that many of the like mean-spirited criticisms of Gigi Wu were and are unfair. That's also not to say that there is no room for criticizing her actions and her choices leading up to her death either. I'm always careful not to victim blame in these situations. With that said, I hope you can understand that we can take a close look at what caused her accident with the goal of extracting lessons for future hikers and without the goal of just putting her down after her death. I think there's two somewhat obvious things that Gigi Wu did on her final hike that were risky. I've actually already touched on one of these things a little bit, but the other one I haven't mentioned at all yet. So the first thing is that, once again, Gigi Wu was hiking on an unofficial, unmaintained trail all by herself. And as I said earlier, I'm not against solo hiking, but I do think that if you're gonna do it, that it's probably safest to either go on a trail that is at least somewhat well-traveled, or go on a trail that you're already familiar with. And of course, that's not gonna eliminate all risk, but it will eliminate a lot of it. It's my understanding that Gigi Wu had never hiked on the trail that she died on, and so if she had been with a hiking partner, it's certainly possible that her partner could have set up her shelter, gotten her into her sleeping bag, and just kept her warm, and maybe she wouldn't have died from hypothermia. Now, the other risky thing that Gigi Wu did is a little bit more controversial, maybe a little bit harder to like pinpoint. So apparently on a lot of her hikes, she was known to carry a pretty heavy backpack with a lot of gear. Now, there's no like perfect number for how much your pack should weigh, but I can definitely tell you from experience, I mean, I've hiked thousands of miles. The heavier your pack is, the harder it is on your body, the harder it is to balance, and this is especially true in slippery conditions. Now, it's also true that you can definitely go too light. Like, you obviously still need to carry sufficient gear to be safe and to survive out there, but Gigi Wu was apparently known for carrying a lot of like extra weight on her back. Now, I didn't know her, obviously, and I definitely don't know exactly what her pack weight was, but it has been reported that for her longer trips, like the one that she was on when she died, she was sometimes carrying up to 70 pounds on her back. Again, I don't know if that was exactly what she was carrying on her last hike, but that was apparently common for her. If you're like an old school backpacker, 70 pounds might sound normal to you, but I'm gonna tell you right now, by 2019, there was almost no reason for a backpacker to carry 70 pounds on a 3-season hike. I'm assuming some of, or probably a lot of that weight was like food and stuff that you kind of need, but the point I'm trying to make here is that backpacking gear technology has advanced so much in recent years, and as an experienced hiker, I'm sure that Gigi was aware of the ultralight gear that she could have been using. Again, I don't know exactly what like the gear culture in Taiwan is like, but I don't know. She had enough experience. I'm sure she knew this, and so I'm really not sure why she didn't make an effort to go lighter with her gear. Maybe there's a reason. Maybe there's something I'm missing, and so you can let me know what your thoughts on this are in the comments. Now, something I saw in my research is that because of her social media pages, it was reported that she carried like a lot of camera gear, and that definitely added some weight to her pack. And to be clear, I'm not saying that this is like a definitive reason for why she lost her life. It's just something to consider. Packing smart, but also packing lightweight in the backcountry, in my opinion, is the safest way to backpack. And I know a lot of hikers with thousands of miles under their belts who definitely would agree with that. And so maybe her pack weight contributed to her death. Maybe it didn't. Maybe the fact that she had the camera stuff because of her page on social media contributed. We just really don't know. But I still just think the pack weight thing is an important lesson for all hikers to take away from this story. There was a silver lining to the end of Gigi Wu's story. Her death brought a lot of attention to these like unofficial network of trails that existed in Taiwan, and because of this, the government actually made some enormous changes. Millions of dollars were to be invested in restoring unofficial trails, renovating backcountry cabins, and perhaps most importantly, building new cell phone towers so that hikers would have an increased chance of being able to call for help. So with all that said, what do you guys think of Gigi Wu's story? Do you think that the media was fair in their coverage of her death, or do you think they, were misleading? Do you think her accident was just bad luck, or was it only a matter of time before something happened to her when she was solo hiking on these trails? And of course, if you can think of any other takeaways, any other lessons for hikers from her story, please leave them in the comments below. In the spring of 2017, David O'Sullivan descended into the small mountain town of Idlewild, California to rest up. He was through hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, having started at the Mexican border, and was hoping to be one of the few hikers who make it all the way up the country to the Canadian border where the trail ends. At this point, however, O'Sullivan still had a lot of ground to cover. He had only hiked about 180 miles of the 2,650 miles that make up the PCT. On April 6th, 2017, O'Sullivan sent an email to his parents informing them that he was planning on heading back to the trail late the next morning. He also sent a message to a friend that he was planning on meeting up with about 4 weeks in the future. The two made some loose plans and expected to reconnect just before the time of the meetup. A month went by and the friend reached out to O'Sullivan again, writing, quote, "Hey, when should I expect you to arrive here?" O'Sullivan never replied. The next day, the friend tried again, this time just writing, "Hello?" ? Nobody knew it quite yet, but there was no way for O'Sullivan to reply. And that's because a month earlier, he had hiked back out to the PCT from town and then simply vanished. He wasn't carrying a cell phone or GPS with him, and he had no way to call for help. Years have gone by, and no trace of him, or his gear for that matter, has ever been found. This is the mysterious story and disappearance of David O'Sullivan. In the spring of 2017, David O'Sullivan traveled from his home country of Ireland all the way to the west coast of the United States to take on a thru hike of the Pacific Crest Trail, or PCT for short. The PCT is a long-distance hiking trail that runs border to border from Mexico to Canada, passing through California, Oregon, and Washington states respectively. O'Sullivan was 25 years old at the time and had graduated from University College Cork in 2014 with a degree in English and philosophy. He was known as a thoughtful, kind, and loyal man, but wasn't exactly an athlete. However, most thru hikers aren't athletes. I've thru hiked quite a bit myself, and I'll be the first to tell you, I'm definitely not one. To try and make up for this, O'Sullivan spent months training before he flew to the United States, doing things like strength training, running, and hiking around in the mountains of Ireland. However, the terrain on the PCT is much different than Ireland. The high elevation portions of the PCT receive considerable amounts of snow, which last well into the spring, and back home in Ireland, O'Sullivan would not get the chance to train in these dangerous conditions. And to make matters worse, O'Sullivan would have no choice but to start his hike in March. You see, you need a permit to hike the PCT, and these permits are granted through a lottery system. This means that many hikers do not get to choose their start date, and March is early in the season. Now, the conditions are going to vary year to year, but in the spring of 2017, there was still plenty of lingering snowpack in the San Jacinto Mountains. But this didn't dissuade O'Sullivan. He had spent months preparing physically and financially, and on March 22nd, 2017, he stood at the southern terminus of the Pacific Crest Trail and then took his first steps north. And like many PCT hikers before and after him, things started out pretty rough. O'Sullivan started with a very heavy pack, and it seems as though by day 3, he realized that something was gonna have to change. This is definitely one of the most common problems that first-time thru hikers face, but fortunately, there's usually plenty of other hikers around these first-timers that are more than willing to help and give advice. It appears as though O'Sullivan had gotten confused when prepping his gear, writing, quote, "I got my kilos and pounds mixed up when I was measuring it." Fortunately for him, when he made it into the town of Mount Laguna, another hiker and employee at a local store helped him switch up his gear. O'Sullivan later wrote, quote, "I think I've dropped about 12 pounds of equipment since day 1, and I can really feel it. I've been flying ever since. So things were improving for O'Sullivan. He started hiking at a faster pace, and he even hit his first 20-mile day shortly after leaving Mount Laguna. However, it still wasn't easy for him per se, which is something that another hiker actually noted. When O'Sullivan made it to the base of the San Jacinto Mountains, roughly 150 miles into the PCT, he sat down at the famous Paradise Valley Cafe just a short distance off the trail. He was having a meal with another hiker who later wrote in his blog, quote, "I sat down and talked to a fellow thru hiker, Dave from Ireland. Cracked lips and peeling skin attested to his story of losing his sun hat a few days ago. I got kind of a general feeling he was kind of getting slapped around by being out on the trail. That's probably why I was trying to push him towards not trying anything he was not prepared for." But this hiker also noted that O'Sullivan was in good spirits and he hadn't said anything about potentially quitting the trail. Later that day, O'Sullivan returned to the PCT, continued hiking, and a short while after that, he descended into the town of Idlewild, California to rest up and resupply. On April 5th, O'Sullivan checked into the Idlewild Inn, planning to stay for 2 nights. An important note here is that O'Sullivan made the odd choice of not carrying a cell phone on his thru hike. I'm not exactly sure why this is, but my loose understanding is that it was kind of a logistical thing. Like when you come into the US from abroad, you have to like get a new phone or a new SIM card. And I know it's doable, but it's just a little bit of a pain. And so it seems like that maybe was the reason why. I don't think it was like a, oh, I'm going out in the wilderness, so I don't want technology kind of thing, which you do see some people do as well. Because of this, the only way O'Sullivan could access the internet was by connecting to Wi-Fi on his Kindle. And he was having a problem with this. He hadn't brought the correct charging adapter with him from Ireland, which is another problem that international travelers and hikers sometimes have to deal with. And he was actually expecting a new adapter to be arriving in the mail while he was in Idlewild. However, there was some sort of shipping mix-up, and in his final email to his parents, O'Sullivan complained that he would have to get a late start the next day so that he could wait for the post office to open. By now, it was April 6th, and that very same day, O'Sullivan signed a trail register in town for what would be the last time. The next morning, presumably, he hiked out of town, and he was never seen again. Now, obviously, when looking for missing hikers, time is of the essence. The quicker the hiker is reported missing, the more likely they are to be found alive. Tragically, one of the most frustrating aspects of O'Sullivan's story is that even though he was last seen in April, he wasn't officially reported missing until July. You heard that right. Months went by before he was ever entered into any missing persons database. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but the truth is that it really wasn't anybody's fault. Since O'Sullivan wasn't carrying a cell phone, he had told his family that it might be hard to keep in contact with them, and if they don't hear from him for periods of time, not to worry. His mother was quoted saying, "We unfortunately took this," referring to the previous statement to his family by O'Sullivan, "to mean that weeks could pass without news." And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. Following O'Sullivan's directions, the family didn't raise any alarms until May, when they contacted the Irish police and began asking around on Facebook to see if any other PCT hikers had seen O'Sullivan. They also contacted his bank to see if there had been any activity on his account. When they did this, they actually received some encouraging news. The bank reported to the family that there was still activity on his bank account, and this caused his family to just go back to waiting, hoping that he would eventually send them an email confirming his whereabouts and his safety. However, this email never came. By the end of June, roughly 2.5 months from when they had last heard from O'Sullivan, his family once again stepped up the effort to locate him. And in doing this, they discovered that the bank had messed up, and messed up big, mind you. It was true that there had been activity on O'Sullivan's account, but it was in the form of automatic scheduled payments. No true bank activity had been recorded since O'Sullivan left Idlewild back in April. His family contacted the Irish consulate in San Francisco, and through that they got in touch with an Irish outreach group in San Diego. Eventually, through this connection, an Irish-American police officer in a different jurisdiction from Idlewild became involved and entered O'Sullivan into the state and federal missing persons databases. But by this point, it was July 13th. So much time had gone by, and so when a search was finally started, it seemed unlikely that they were going to find O'Sullivan alive, and I think a lot of the searchers were probably viewing it as more of a body recovery mission than a search and rescue mission. The authorities spent the next few months intermittently looking for O'Sullivan. They used helicopters, they used cadaver dogs, and large-scale ground searches. But then, in mid-October of 2017, they abruptly closed the case and stopped searching. This frustrated the family immensely. But fortunately for them, a group of volunteers refused to give up on the case. Kathy Tarr has been leading the effort to find O'Sullivan since the authorities closed the case. I had the pleasure of speaking with Tarr pretty extensively, and she provided much of the information that I've included in this video. She began her own investigation into what happened after witnessing the displeasure that O'Sullivan's family had towards the effort, or lack thereof, displayed by the authorities in Idlewild. And it's through her efforts, as well as the efforts of all the other volunteers working with her, that I really do believe O'Sullivan will be found one day. I really do think eventually his family will get some answers, but unfortunately, we don't have any of those answers yet. So the big questions here are, what could have happened to David O'Sullivan? How did he just vanish, and what leads have emerged so far? And while we obviously don't know exactly what happened, there are some plausible explanations. On April 7th, 2017, the day that O'Sullivan hiked out of Idlewild, there may not have been any snow down in town, but at the higher elevations, particularly on the Fowler Ridge stretch of the PCT, this was not the case. There was still up to 3 feet of snow, and O'Sullivan had no experience hiking in these harsh conditions. That spring, multiple hikers were injured in the area that O'Sullivan went missing from, and a number of them required rescue. It's due to this that Kathy Tarr believes the most likely scenario is that O'Sullivan hiked out, he was unprepared for the conditions, and either fell somewhere or got lost and eventually perished, and his body simply just hasn't been recovered yet. Many years have passed, but it's still likely that he is out there somewhere. And another complicating factor is that when O'Sullivan left Idlewild to head back up to the PCT, there are a number of different trails that he could have taken. And unfortunately, he left no indication of which one of these trails he was going to take. All of these routes have been searched extensively, but no sign of O'Sullivan has been found yet. Regulations on drone use have also complicated the search, leaving volunteers with little other option than to painstakingly search the areas around the trails, bushwhacking on foot. Now, another intriguing part of this case is that there have been a few unconfirmed sightings of O'Sullivan after he left Idlewild. A trail angel who helps PCT hikers recalled picking up an Irish hiker along Interstate 10 sometime between April 10th and April 15th. The trail angel stated that O'Sullivan then rested at his house for a few hours, and then the trail angel brought him back to the trail. Interstate 10 would have been a roughly 2-day hike from Idlewild, so the timeline almost checks out. However, Kathy Tarr doesn't believe this sighting to be credible because there was other hikers that the trail angel had picked up, and there was other hikers staying at his house, and 0 of them remembered O'Sullivan being there. The PCT is a very popular thing for international travelers to do, so the trail angel could have very easily been confused by the accents. There was also a few unconfirmed sightings of O'Sullivan on or near Fowler Ridge. One witness was 100% sure he saw O'Sullivan at a trail intersection here. However, timestamps from the witness's photos were way off from the timeline, meaning it was almost certainly somebody else. There were multiple other PCT hikers in 2017 that resembled O'Sullivan, such as the hiker pictured next to him right here. I mean, they look almost identical. There were also a few unconfirmed sightings of him further north in Wrightwood, California, which is another popular PCT town, but it would have been nearly impossible for O'Sullivan to have made it this far without another actual confirmed sighting of him or without him making any activity on his bank account. There's also one other frightening theory, one that O'Sullivan's mother expressed concern about in an article that I read. This theory is that O'Sullivan could have accidentally stumbled upon an illegal marijuana grow and perished as a result of foul play. And then a sub-theory of that theory is that maybe he perished accidentally due to an accident, but then his body was discovered by illegal marijuana growers, and so they disposed of it quietly, didn't tell anybody because they didn't want to attract any attention to what they were doing. And while there have been multiple illegal marijuana grows discovered around the San Jacinto wilderness, if O'Sullivan had stayed on or near the PCT, there's no chance that he would have stumbled across any of these. There's never been any additional evidence to suggest this is what happened. And because of all these factors, Kathy Tarr believes that this is a very unlikely scenario. And of course, whenever an individual goes missing, there's always the question of whether or not they simply ran off intentionally to start a new life somewhere. O'Sullivan's family insists that he would not have done this, and no evidence exists that he did. In all likelihood, O'Sullivan remains somewhere off trail in the wilderness of San Jacinto. And as I said a few minutes ago, due to the efforts of Kathy Tarr, I really do believe that he will be found someday. Kathy Tarr's volunteer team continues searching for O'Sullivan and any sign of his gear, and they're taking it seriously, following up on any and all leads that come in. At one point, they even ran an experiment, leaving a copy of his backpack out in the sun to see how it would look when faded. They continue to search to this day, and Kathy even founded the Fowler O'Sullivan Foundation, named after David O'Sullivan and Chris Fowler, who's another missing PCT hiker who I previously did a video on. I'll have a link to that video in the description as well as right up here. The Fowler O'Sullivan Foundation's mission is to, quote, provide assistance to families of missing hikers, connect them to vetted resources, facilitate searches on their behalf once official efforts have been suspended, and support initiatives to prevent future missing hiker cases. They even give away Garmin InReach Mini GPS devices to prospective PCT hikers every single year, which I think is just awesome. I have a link to their website in the description, and I highly suggest you check it out and consider making a donation. They've assisted in solving multiple missing persons cases over the past few years. I know that I have a pretty decent amount of people watching this video right now that will be traveling on the PCT in the future. If you're hiking near Idlewild or San Jacinto, please keep an eye out for any missing gear, especially if you end up off trail somehow. And also, please take note of any places that you slip, accidentally get lost, or just have any sort of mishaps while you're in this area. Make note of them and please report them, because Kathy Tarr will be interested in hearing about them, because they could lead to a new place to check or a new theory about what could have happened, and it could just turn into another lead for Kathy Tarr and her volunteers to check out. To report this information or anything at all related to David O'Sullivan's disappearance, please send an email to info@fofound.org. I want to thank Kathy Tarr for helping me with this video, and I also want to thank David O'Sullivan's parents for giving me their blessing to make this. On the last day of August in 1998, a solo hiker was struggling past an unnamed lake deep in the Wind River Range of Wyoming. This hiker was on a 9-day off-trail expedition that would be taking him through some of the most remote terrain in the mainland United States, and as if that wasn't already daunting enough, when he arrived at the trailhead, this hiker was greeted by an eerie sign. It was a missing persons poster for a man who had disappeared only a few weeks earlier while covering a nearly identical route through the same mountains. This hiker was undeterred by this, however, and they set out anyways, though they definitely made a mental note to keep their eyes out for anything suspicious. And then, a few days later, this man was making his way along some loose rocks near the shore of a remote alpine lake. There were no trails in this area, and the man probably figured that he was all alone, likely the first person to traverse this lake in months, if not years. But this was not the case, because all of a sudden when the man looked up, he noticed another man about 50 yards away from him just sitting in the rocks. Something seemed off about this man, because he was just sitting there completely still. You could even say eerily still. This hiker called out to the sitting man and asked him if he was okay. And to this, the hiker got no response. 3 days later, this very same hiker walked into the Sublette County Sheriff's Office and plopped down a wallet that belonged to Reverend Mike Turner. Mike Turner had vanished while on a backpacking trip in the Wind River Range a few weeks earlier, and it was actually his name that was plastered on the missing person posters at every trailhead in the area. So, even though Mike Turner's body had now been discovered, his disappearance remained shrouded in mystery. Well, at least initially. This didn't last very long, because right there next to his body, investigators found his journal. And through that journal, Mike Turner's friends, his family, and eventually the world were able to take a detailed look into the final days of a man who lived and died through every solo hiker's worst nightmare. This is the story of Reverend Mike Turner. All right, folks, I'm not gonna lie to you. This story, well, it's pretty up. It's definitely not for the faint of heart, but it's also incredibly unique, even somewhat inspiring, and also certainly morbidly fascinating. So, with that said, together, let's take a trip to the Wind River Range in Wyoming along the Continental Divide. This trip will cost you nothing. It's totally free. All you have to do is hit the subscribe button and help us get to our goal of 1 million subscribers, especially if you're a repeat viewer. At the end of July in 1998, Reverend Mike Turner set off into the Wyoming wilderness. He had a very ambitious plan. He was going to take roughly 9 days to travel 60 miles through the Wind River Range on a route that was largely off of any established trails. He was also planning to do this route without a hiking partner, completely solo. Well, that is, I guess, unless you consider his dog Andy a hiking partner, because he was bringing along the dog. Mike was far from a beginner backpacker and reportedly felt very comfortable in the outdoors. He had spent numerous nights backpacking in Wyoming, the Sierra Nevada, Rocky Mountain National Park, among many other wild and beautiful places. He reportedly felt close to God when he was in the backcountry, and it seems as though his adventures in the mountains were more than just a good time for Turner. They were essentially a very important part of his spirituality. Prior to his trip to Wyoming, Mike Turner had been a pastor at Boone Memorial Presbyterian Church in Caldwell, Idaho. He had been with the church for 10 years, but during the last few months leading up to his Wyoming trip, he had actually been on sabbatical. And unfortunately, maybe, his sabbatical was coming to an end, and so he wanted to finish it off in epic fashion. And for someone adventurous like Mike Turner, that meant traversing the high glaciers, 12,000-foot passes, and untouched alpine lakes all by himself. He even came up with a name for his itinerary, which was Wander in Wonder. The night before his adventure began, Mike Turner took his wife out to a James Taylor concert. And then the next morning, he surprised her with flowers and a handwritten card which read, quote, "Thank you for letting me live this adventure. Know wherever I am and whatever I'm doing, I am thinking of you." And with that said, on July 30th, 1998, Mike Turner and his dog Andy hiked into the Wyoming backcountry, eventually settling in for the night at Eklund Lake in Bridger-Teton National Forest. Since Mike Turner was a man of deep thought and frequent reflection, it's no surprise that he brought along a journal with him. I'm not sure if he was one to share his journal entries with others. I feel like it's most likely that these journal entries were only meant for his eyes and his mind. In time, however, the whole world would be reading parts of this particular journal, and this journal would essentially become Mike Turner's final words. On the first night of his trip, Turner relaxed and he pondered God's impact on the natural world and God's impact on Turner's trip through the mountains. He wrote, quote, "You send the winds and the rain, and yet even amidst the deep savagery and destruction of life, I sense your hand. In threatening my comfort, even my life, you challenge me to cope. In beauty and peace, you refresh me, and all of it I need. God bless this trip. May it fulfill your holy purposes." Mike Turner would write similar sentiments over the next 2 days, all the way until day 4 of his trip. Day 4 is when everything fell apart for Reverend Mike Turner. So 9 days go by. 9 days after his adventure had began, Mike's wife was waiting for him to finish, and she was starting to get worried. So their plan was that Mike was going to meet his friends and his family at the Big Sandy Trailhead in Bridger Teton National Forest, once again 9 days after he had entered the wilderness, which would have put his end date at August 8th, 1998. And to be even more specific than that, he actually planned to get there at noon. But of course, Mike's wife knew that this was wishful thinking. It would be far too difficult to pinpoint an exact arrival time before the trip had even begun. And sure enough, Mike was nowhere to be found when noon rolled around. I'm sure this probably made his wife a bit uneasy, but she was also far from calling in rescue at this point. They actually had a plan B, which was for them to hike in a little bit and meet Mike at Dad's Lake. But as the day went by, Mike failed to show up there at their plan B location as well. The gravity of the situation slowly started to sink in, and Mike's wife began to recall a conversation that she had had with Mike and their daughter before he left. In that conversation, all of them had decided that if Mike didn't arrive by 4 p.m. Sunday, then the authorities would be contacted. Sunday came, and then Sunday went. And sure enough, there was still no sign of Mike. Friends and family waited a bit longer than their agreed upon time, hoping that they would eventually see Mike come stumbling down the trail. But unfortunately, this never happened. And so finally, on Monday, August 10th, 1998 at 10:06 a.m., Mike Turner was officially reported missing. Searchers knew that finding Mike was going to take an absolute miracle. They needed to cover hundreds of square miles of basically untouched wilderness, and they needed to do it fast. Tip Top Search and Rescue, a volunteer search and rescue organization in the area, were called in. They searched on foot, they searched by horse, and they even searched by helicopter. They searched as hard as they could for 2 whole weeks, but by August 23rd, they still hadn't found any trace of Mike Turner, and eventually the active search was called off. But then, 5 days later, something happened that nobody saw coming. On August 28th, Reverend Turner's dog, Andy, walked out of the wilderness, battered, bruised, and starving, but alive. This renewed the search efforts for Mike, as the searchers hoped the dog could lead them in the right direction. And this is reportedly what the dog actually did, although unfortunately, by the time they got the dog out there, it was pretty much too late. On August 31st, a man who was traversing the Wind River Range on a near identical route to Mike Turner's discovered Turner's body near an unnamed alpine lake. Turner was reportedly sitting up with his legs jammed between 2 boulders. The hiker who made this discovery was actually aware of Mike Turner's disappearance because this hiker had seen missing person posters at his starting trailhead, and so he actually grabbed Turner's wallet and continued on through the wilderness to report what he had found. This should give you an idea of how remote this area is, by the way. Mike Turner's body was discovered on August 31st, but it wasn't until September 3rd that the man finally reached the Sublette County Sheriff's Office to report the tragic news. When investigators finally made their way out to Reverend Mike Turner's body, they were greeted by a very depressing sight. Turner's legs had in fact been pinned between boulders, which rendered him completely unable to move. And perhaps even more disturbingly, the injury caused by the boulders was not what led to Turner's death. In fact, he was barely injured by them at all. He just couldn't move. He was 100% trapped. An autopsy actually revealed that the cause of death was hypothermia and dehydration, despite the fact that he was trapped only 30 feet away from a lake. So, the overall picture of what happened was becoming clear, but what makes the story of Mike Turner so fascinating is that he actually kept a detailed journal during his ordeal, and so now the world has been able to take a glimpse into the mind of the man's intense struggles with Mother Nature, his inevitable death, and his faith. Through this journal, we're able to learn in excruciating detail the disturbing but also inspiring story of what really happened to Mike Turner. In his journal, he wrote that on day 4, he was hiking through a boulder field above 11,000 feet in elevation, and one of the boulders that he stepped on came loose. In response to this, he quickly jumped to the next one, but he actually fell. And as he did this, the boulder that had come loose moments earlier came tumbling down and trapped his legs. According to his journal, it was a roughly 800-pound rock. One of Mike Turner's close friends said, quote, "When he tried to extricate himself, his legs wouldn't move. They weren't broken, barely even injured, but his feet were suspended in air. He couldn't push them down or pull them up. Sideways motion was equally impossible beyond an inch or so. The two boulders had come together in the perfect configuration to form a pair of granite shackles." Mike Turner fought hard to free himself in the immediate aftermath of what happened. He was carrying a camera tripod, and he actually attempted to use this tripod to pry himself free. He struggled for over an hour, nearly breaking the tripod before he realized that the effort was pointless. And so with this realization, this very scary realization, I'm sure, Reverend Turner opened his journal. "About 2 hours ago, a large rock rolled upon me and trapped my legs. I was very careful, be sure of that, but I hurt. I am in your hands, Lord. I don't know what I face." Eventually, Turner realized that his only hope was for someone to come to his aid. And so with that realization, he turned his attention to surviving rather than rescuing himself and freeing himself. There was actually some snow within, reaching distance of him, and so he was able to use his stove to melt this snow for drinking water. And since he had his overnight gear with him, he was able to awkwardly insulate himself in order to survive that first night. I'm sure it wasn't comfortable or pleasant, but he did make it through the night, and he wrote this the next morning. "I am concerned about first losing my legs, second running out of snow to melt for water and fuel, third hypothermia. My biggest concern is water. I only have 2 quarts left. The irony is that the lake is only 30 feet away." And then in a almost sarcastic tone, but also a very he wrote this, super disturbing. "I am also saving my urine. I wonder how it will taste with crystal light." Mike Turner had to be meticulous about all of his gear, because if any of it fell out of reach, it was basically gone for good because he couldn't move. He couldn't go grab it. At this point, he still had a week's worth of food, and he used his tent's rainfly to try and capture some of the rainfall. After he had melted all of the snow within his reach, he tied his water bottle to a rope and tried to throw it the 30 feet into the lake in order to grab some more water. Amazingly, it actually almost made it, but it didn't quite make it. It instead fell short of the lake, and it got caught in the rocks, and he wasn't able to get it back. Despite the just incredibly scary situation he was in, Turner was actually initially optimistic about his chances of survival. He wrote, quote, "I had dreamed of a special time alone with God, facing the elements, the passes, thinking about my life, the direction of the church, about my family. Indeed, this has been all of those things, only magnified 100 times. When I think about it this way, I believe I will survive smarter or wiser, more thoughtful, more aware of my limits. I do feel confident in my Christian hope. God will make a way, either earthly or heavenly." This optimism, unfortunately, did not last, and you can probably understand why. Mike Turner had now been pinned for days with no sign of help, and this brutal reality was spiritually challenging for even the strongest of believers in God. It became evident in his writing that the Reverend felt abandoned by the very God he had dedicated his life to serving. God is with me, but I am angry with him. Why this terrible injustice? Or is it the product of pride? How am I failing him? Or what does he need me to teach? What is the purpose of this ordeal? Will I ever know, or continue to be puzzled, angered, and feel quite abandoned by the one I serve? This would have been the perfect time for another hiker to come along, rescue Mike Turner, and provide a happy ending to this story. But unfortunately, that's not what happened, because things only got worse from here. One evening, Mike Turner noticed that he had completely lost feeling in his left leg, and this sent him into a desperate frenzy to free himself. But of course, there was nothing that he could do, and he probably knew this deep down, and ultimately, his struggle trying to save his leg ended with the leg just being trapped even tighter. I cried out and cried out to God, who doesn't seem to care about my suffering, struggling, and pain, and the loss of my left leg. I begged and prayed for some help in moving the rock, but none seemed to come. After either 5 or 6 days, Mike Turner accidentally dropped his journal out of reach while he was shifting around. In a testament to how important documenting his struggle was to him, he was actually undeterred by losing his journal, and he began using anything at his disposal to jot down his thoughts. He was carrying a pocket Bible with him, and he began filling the blank pages in this Bible with his writing. Eventually, he did run out of space there, and at this point, he turned to the margins of the instructions for his stove. Mike Turner eventually became consumed with regret. At one point during his hike, he had actually decided to stray a little bit from his planned itinerary, and he took a different pass through the mountains. And unfortunately, it's on this detour that he became pinned by the boulder. He wrote, quote, "I feel so foolish taking this longer pass. So lonely, more than I imagined. Thought I would be found yesterday. Many thoughts, most of church, future for kids, some friends. I love you, Diane," referring to his wife. "Terribly sorry for stupid, illegible." So he was obviously in a very bad situation, and, just mentally and spiritually, this is just really tough. But at some point, Reverend Mike Turner did come to accept his inevitable death. His body was breaking down, and he knew that there was pretty much nothing more that he could do. Rather than questioning God, expressing bitterness and anger, he turned to God, and he turned to him with open arms. "Fill me with peace, Lord. May the conditions not deny my love for you. I am ready to die, though missing my family. To live is Christ. To die is gain. I will trust in God, though he will slay me, yet I will trust him. He is the way, the truth, the light." At some point, Turner placed his wedding ring on a rock next to him so that it would not fall off his fingers and get lost. After surviving for 10 days, pinned to the rock the entire time, unable to move, Turner stopped writing in his journal. The last line he ever wrote said, quote, "God loves illegible. Love, Dad, Mike." So obviously things were different in 1998, but I will note that today, if something similar like this were to happen, if a hiker were to become pinned down or just immobilized in any manner, a satellite GPS with an SOS button could be used to call for help. Again, I'm not really sure if these devices were widely available in 1998. I don't blame Mike Turner for not having one of these, but nowadays, I think every hiker should certainly have one. And I think an important takeaway from this story is that not only should you have one of these devices when you go in the backcountry, but you should also pack it in a place that is easily accessible and pack it in a manner where it's not gonna fall or become out of reach. Myself and a lot of other hikers will hang it with a carabiner on your shoulder strap. I also want to note something that I'm sure many of you maybe already have pointed out in the comments. This is that if Mike Turner had not been hiking solo, his hiking partner could have either helped push the boulder off of him, or gone to summon help, and Turner probably would have survived. It is true that solo hiking, especially off trail in remote areas like this, carries greater risk. Let's be perfectly clear about that. However, a lot of people still choose to do it anyway. And to this point, Mike Turner's wife was actually quoted saying, "We knew an extended solo hike could be dangerous, but I've always believed that to live fully sometimes involves risk. Our Christian faith points us towards a life of courage." So I've mentioned her a few times now. Mike Turner is survived by his wife, and he's also survived by 2 daughters and a son. Though they were obviously devastated by the loss of Mike, the journal that he left behind did bring them some comfort, and it served as an inspiration for all of those that have had the privilege of reading from it. Tip Top Search and Rescue were the organization that responded to Mike Turner's disappearance. Again, this was back in 1998, and they're actually still going strong to this day, working tirelessly to save lives, all done on a volunteer basis. I'm not affiliated with them. They don't know I'm making this video, but I do encourage you to support them by making a donation. I've done so myself, and I'll have their website linked in the description. I appreciate all of you so much who are joining me in my mission to give back to the search and rescue heroes involved with so many of the stories I cover on my channel. My heart goes out to Mike Turner, his wife, his kids, and all of his other friends and family. In early May of 2005, 59-year-old John Donovan was heading north on the Pacific Crest Trail up Mount San Jacinto. Located in Southern California, the surrounding area largely consists of dry desert, but the higher up you climb, the harsher and colder the climate gets. On his climb up, Donovan was already encountering deep snow, and the worst was yet to come because a heavy storm was on the way. By the time he reached 8,000 feet in elevation, he needed help and tried to follow 2 Canadian hikers who were in front of him who were much more experienced in the harsh conditions than he was. About a half-mile south of Saddle Junction, the Canadian hikers made note that John was still behind them. One of the trails at this junction leads down into town and into safety. However, Donovan never made it into town. He never made it into safety, and he was never seen again. Searches were unsuccessful, and it seemed like Donovan's time was up. He had 59 years of life to leave his mark on the world, and he certainly did just that. However, though his life may have been over, it would turn out that Donovan would have one more chance to leave his mark on the world and help out some hikers who were in dire need. This is the tragic yet incredible story of John Donovan. John Donovan spent most of his life living on the East Coast and ended up joining the Navy, where he spent 15 years serving his country. By the time he was in his 40s, he had taken up hiking as a hobby to lose weight and to spend more time outside. He ended up becoming very involved with the hiking community and joined the Old Dominion chapter of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, which is a group in Virginia dedicated to recreation and conservation of the Appalachian Trail in that area. It's through this group that he ended up meeting one of his best friends, 60-year-old Ken Baker. Baker and Donovan would go on to complete roughly 100 backpacking trips together, and each man became a very accomplished hiker. John Donovan would go on to hike the 500-mile Colorado Trail and completed the entire Appalachian Trail in section hikes over the course of a decade. It's no surprise that after all this experience, the next goal that Donovan decided to take on was a thru hike of the Pacific Crest Trail, which runs border to border through California, Oregon, and Washington State. John Donovan was originally planning to hike the PCT with his friend Ken Baker, since the two had spent so much time hiking together over the years. However, in the spring of 2005, as the two were getting ready to set out on their thru hike, Baker decided that their original April start date should be postponed a few weeks due to unsafe snow conditions. Donovan, however, disagreed and insisted on sticking to the original plan. This worried Baker because Donovan had been known to get lost from time to time when hiking. Donovan had spent a year planning his thru hike of the PCT, and he did not want to wait a few extra weeks for the snow to melt. Ken Baker was quoted saying, "I'd look at the weather data, and Southern California had just had its snowiest winter in 30 or 40 years. When Baker confronted Donovan with this reality, Donovan's response was something along the lines of, quote, "The crowds up ahead will blaze a trail through the snow. I'll be all right." And thus, towards the end of April in 2005, John Donovan retired, and he set out from the Mexican border, hiking north towards Canada. He ended up starting the PCT with a different friend, actually, named Lynn Paget, who had hiked the Appalachian Trail in 1997. However, Paget was no longer in hiking shape and ended up leaving the PCT near the town of Warner Springs, only about roughly 100 miles into the thru hike. And so after that, Donovan continued on all by himself. Less than 50 miles later, he started the long climb up Mount San Jacinto, which is the first large mountain that northbound PCT hikers will climb. Though the PCT itself doesn't go all the way to the summit, it does climb up the majority of the mountain, reaching over 9,000 feet in elevation. It was now May 2nd, 2005, and though the desert floor thousands of feet below him was certainly starting to warm up, the opposite was happening on San Jacinto. There was still at least 3 feet of snow left in the higher elevations, and more was on the way. On the night of May 2nd, John Donovan camped near 2 other hikers who were both from Canada, and during their conversations, he had apparently rubbed them the wrong way, though I don't think it was like a full-on fight or anything. They just got a weird vibe from him, it sounds like. The hikers camped out that night, and then the next day, John Donovan began climbing Fowler Ridge, which is a steep and technical part of the trail that requires special equipment such as crampons and an ice axe in snowy conditions. He began climbing shortly before the storm hit, and he was even warned about the conditions up ahead by some hikers who were coming down the ridge. One of these hikers was quoted saying, "We weren't going to change his mind. He was emphatic about going up Fowler Ridge." Donovan was carrying spikes for his feet, but he was not carrying an ice axe. It's speculated that he may have not been carrying it because he wanted to save weight in his pack, which is a very common thing that PCT and other thru hikers want to do, though I can't say for sure that this was his reasoning. By 1 p.m., it appears that John Donovan had finally realized that he had made a big mistake. He had descended off the ridge down into Little Tahquitz Valley and was having a very difficult time seeing the trail, which was now hidden underneath the snow. It's at this point that he ran into the 2 Canadian hikers he had camped with the previous night. Donovan decided that his best chance at survival was to try and tag along with these 2 hikers who both had more experience at altitude and had better snow equipment than he did. Donovan stayed about 30 feet behind these 2 hikers and apparently fell repeatedly. He was trying to use his crampons, but they didn't fit well with his lightweight trail running shoes. One of these Canadian hikers was quoted saying, "He was having a hard time, but he seemed healthy, and it seemed to me that he was going to hike up Fowler Ridge if he wanted to. I remember thinking, he's an adult, I won't tell him what to do." Eventually, the group of hikers came within roughly a half mile of Saddle Junction. I remember Saddle Junction from my Pacific Crest Trail hike. This is a major trail intersection with a bailout point that leads a few miles down into the town of Idlewild, California. I don't know this for a fact, I'm speculating here, but I think what John Donovan probably wanted to do was get to this junction and then take that trail, I believe it's called the Devil's Slide Trail, down into Idlewild and down into safety. But unfortunately, this would never happen because shortly before they reached Saddle Junction, Donovan became separated from the other hikers and they would not make contact with him again. So at this point, things were looking pretty dire for John Donovan. But actually, his situation was even worse than what I've described so far. John Donovan never married, and he never had any kids. He didn't really keep in close contact with his family members, and so the only people that even really knew he was on the PCT were a few friends preoccupied with their lives back home. These friends were helping him with supplies, but they weren't keeping close tabs on him and his location. And because of this, 12 days went by before anybody realized that John Donovan was missing. 12 whole days that search and rescue could have been looking for him and potentially saved his life. A friend did eventually realize that something was wrong when Donovan failed to pick up a few of his resupply boxes north of San Jacinto. Search parties were eventually sent out looking for him, but they found nothing, and eventually the search was called off. After Donovan lost sight of the 2 hikers he was following, he tried to change course and head west off the ridge towards Idlewild. He was close to Saddle Junction, but he couldn't find the trail that led down into town, and eventually switched his plan, this time opting to head east towards the town of Palm Springs. He climbed 3 miles down from the ridge towards Palm Springs and eventually stopped for the day in Long Valley. At this point, it appears as though Donovan was either too weak to move on from the campsite or he had just simply simply decided to stay put in that location and wait for rescue. So there he remained, stuck, and he started to turn his attention towards his survival. He tried to build signal fires, but he couldn't get anything going due to all the snow on the ground. He also tried flashing a mirror at the sky to try to get the attention of somebody in a helicopter or something, but unfortunately, that didn't work either. He was running out of food, having only 12 cheese crackers left by May 5th. And honestly, not that much is known about what happened after this point. But on May 14th, Donovan wrote in his journal, quote, "Goodbye and love you all." Though Donovan did not have close ties with his family, he was thoroughly missed by all his friends. He may have been a little rough around the edges, but Donovan had a big heart. He had done social work at a hospital in Petersburg, Virginia, taking disabled and sick patients on field trips. Another social worker that knew him was quoted saying, "He'd lug these patients around all by himself. He'd lift them into the hospital van one by one." One of Donovan's friends had also recalled how Donovan had been there to comfort him after his wife had unfortunately passed away. Quote, "He listened, he helped me see a way out. He offered a breath of fresh air when I needed it the most." And yet another friend recalled how Donovan had helped him recover from trauma related to some abuse that he had suffered as a child. Clearly, Donovan was a great, caring person, and Donovan actually believed that his life's mission, his purpose, if you will, was to help others. And he lived his life in this way. And then, as it turns out, Donovan continued this mission even after he had passed away all alone in the Southern California wilderness. That may sound confusing, but I promise you that sentence will make sense as we get to the next part of this story. On May 6th, 2006, almost exactly 1 year after John Donovan went missing, two tourists that had recently started dating took a trip to Palm Springs, California. 28-year-old Brandon Day and 24-year-old Gina Allen were both from Dallas, Texas, and decided to leave their town and head up the Palm Springs aerial tramway. The tramway climbs up to around 8,500 feet in elevation and provides access to some mountaintop restaurants and other amenities. It's a great way for visitors to experience the high elevation mountains without having to actually hike themselves up there. However, Day and Allen did feel like hiking a little bit, and they actually set out on the 1.5-mile Desert View Trail, which loops around the area near the tramway. While on their hike, the couple heard the sound of a waterfall off in the distance a little bit off the trail, and so they decided to leave the path that they were following and scramble off the trail to try and go and find this waterfall. However, when they turned around and tried to get back on the established trail, they could not find it. They heard voices in the distance and tried to walk towards the voices, but eventually realized that they were hearing echoes. They continued to try to find their way out, but only managed to hike themselves deeper and deeper into the wilderness. By nightfall, the couple was still lost and did not have the proper clothing or equipment to be spending the night above 7,000 feet in elevation. And so they settled in, hoping that the rangers would show up at some point during the night with their flashlights to rescue them. But the rangers never came. And in the morning, the couple climbed further up San Jacinto, hoping that being at a higher elevation would help them be seen easier from the sky. But this plan didn't work. They saw nobody, and nobody saw them. Due to the cold temperatures higher in elevation, they decided to head back down. They changed course and descended deep into the Long Valley. You'll recall, this is the same valley that John Donovan descended into 1 year earlier. 2 more days went by, and then at some point during the scramble down, Brandon Day spotted a yellow backpack. Initially, this filled the couple with hope, but that hope was quickly dashed when they read the date on the journal that they found inside the backpack. Brandon Day was quoted saying, "The entry was dated May 8th, 2005. Exactly a year before. It sank in that someone had died there." They may not have known it at the time, but the couple had just accidentally stumbled upon the campsite of a man whose life mission was to help others. And even though he had long since passed at this point, John Donovan would end up doing exactly that for the lost and desperate couple. Inside John Donovan's discarded pack, Day and Allen found roughly 20 matches which were kept safe and dry inside a plastic bag. When they found the matches, they wasted no time at all and immediately immediately tried to start a signal fire. And a helicopter actually flew over the couple, but as is unfortunately so often the case in these lost hiker stories, the occupants of the helicopter didn't spot the stranded couple. It looked like they would have to spend yet another night out in the cold. But fortunately for the couple, this third night spent sleeping in the wilderness with no extra clothing, no gear, and no extra food would ultimately be their last night. On the morning of May 9th, 2006, the couple made use of John Donovan's matches once again, and this time lit a much bigger fire. Day told Alan, quote, "If we're going out swinging." The flames of this fire grew up to 20 feet in height, and before they knew it, half an acre was burning. There was no way this fire wasn't going to be noticed, and sure enough, shortly after this, a helicopter arrived overhead. The couple was saved. They were rescued, and in the process, they had inadvertently solved the mystery of what had happened to John Donovan. A few weeks later, rescuers returned to the scene to recover Donovan's gear and his body. They found him wrapped in his tarp near a stream about 50 yards down from where Day and Alan had discovered his backpack. Which sounds kind of bizarre, and to this day, we really don't know what exactly led to him being in that final resting place in that state. But what we do know with certainty is that even in his death, John Donovan was helping people. I don't think it's right to say that this story has a happy ending. I think we would all prefer that John Donovan was still alive today, but at least something positive came out of it. If you're planning a hike on the PCT, or really any trail for that matter, please be mindful of the weather, train with the proper equipment needed for tricky snowy conditions, and carry a satellite GPS with an SOS button. I'll have a link to a few popular ones in the description. Please keep John Donovan and his story in your thoughts, and thank you so much for watching. Today, I'm going to be telling you 5 stories of my most dangerous and, well, I'm just going to say it, my most up hikes. The longtime viewers of my channel already know this, but in case you didn't know this, I'm not just a YouTuber and a storyteller. I am an experienced hiker myself. I've hiked well over 5,000 miles in the past 10 years, and I've completed the entirety of the Appalachian Trail and soon the entirety of the Pacific Crest Trail. I've done over 90% of it at this point. And I've done a lot of other stuff too, as we're gonna find out in this video. And when you've hiked that many miles, you're unfortunately pretty much guaranteed to have some dangerous moments every now and again, even if they are few and far between. Some of these were caused by me and my poor decision making, and some of them, to be honest, were just completely random, wrong place at the wrong time, and I think those are probably the scariest. I enjoy telling stories about other people, but today I am excited to get back to my roots and tell my own stories, and honestly kind of make a bit of a fool out of myself in the process, because some of these stories, well, let's just say I'm not particularly proud of them. And though these are my top 5 most dangerous hiking moments, these are definitely not the 5 most dangerous moments that have ever happened to anybody hiking. I just want to be clear about that. Some of these stories, at the risk of, this probably isn't good for the algorithm, but yeah, some of these stories might sound a little bit underwhelming compared to the other ones that I've covered on my channel. There's no search and rescue. There's no being missing for 2 weeks or whatever. I just don't want to BS you, but these still were my most dangerous moments hiking, and they still were very scary. I mean, I won't lie. I was scared as during all of these stories. We're gonna go in order of least dangerous to most dangerous, and I'll tell you right now, the final story I'm gonna tell is by far the closest I've ever come to a near-death experience while hiking, so you're gonna wanna stick around all the way until the end to hear that. And with that said, let's take a trip to the White Mountains of New Hampshire, where innocent little 18-year-old Kyle found himself lying awake in his hammock, frozen with fear. This trip to the Whites is free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer. You'll be helping us reach our goal of 1 million subscribers. I've been going back and forth between 500,000 and 1 million being the next goal. We're just gonna go for 1 million. Free stories, free content in exchange for smashing the subscribe button. I think that's a pretty good deal. Back to the White Mountains. It was the summer of 2014, and I had just graduated from high school, and so rather than spending the summer partying and getting ready for college, I spent most of it chipping away at a peak bagging list called the New Hampshire 48 4,000 footers. In July of that summer, I had a few days off of work, and so I figured I could actually bang out a bunch of these peaks in one trip if I brought my overnight gear and spent the night along the trail. This would only be the second time in my life that I would be solo camping in the backcountry. Day one of this trip was pretty uneventful. I hiked Mount Pierce and then Mount Jackson before finally calling it a night at some random stealth camping spot off of the Appalachian Trail. I honestly have zero recollection of this first night, and so I'm assuming everything went fine, although little did I know the next night would have me this close to shitting myself in my hammock. The next morning I woke up and then charged up Mount Willie, then I hit Mount Field, and then Mount Tom. At this point, I had 5 summits under my belt in less than 24 hours, and I was really starting to feel pretty tired, but I still had Mount Hale left, which thankfully is one of the easiest of all the 4,000 footers. I hit the summit, and then I finally found a spot for camp that evening. I'm not gonna lie, the spot that I chose was not ideal. It wasn't even a real campsite. I basically just walked off the trail and then chose 2 trees for my hammock. One redeeming quality of this campsite, I guess, is that I was right next to a small stream, and so the soothing sounds of that, combined with the fact that I was absolutely wiped from all the hiking, meant that I fell asleep almost as soon as I closed my eyes, a rarity for myself when I'm solo camping. And I actually slept pretty damn good. That is, until about 11 p.m. when I was jolted awake. A massive thunderstorm was rolling through the mountains, and I could tell with each passing boom that it was heading right for me. I'm sure many of you have probably heard that rule that allows you to estimate how far you are from a thunderstorm by like counting the number of seconds between the thunder and the flash. Each second is supposed to equal a mile away, and to be honest with you, I'm pretty sure this system isn't very accurate. It's probably very unscientific, but regardless, I was doing this while I was laying in my hammock, and each time I would see a flash, the boom was happening faster and faster right after it. And before I knew it, this shit was right on top of me. I'm talking the flash and the boom were happening at exactly the same time. It was just one continuous thing. I was quite literally right in the center of the storm. It was downpouring like you couldn't believe, and I was just laying there in my hammock, just trembling. I felt like a total sitting duck. There was literally nothing that I could do besides just wait for it to pass. And let me tell you, it felt like it took forever for that to happen. In reality, these storms move very quickly, and so it was probably only on top of me for a few minutes, but I don't know, dude, those few minutes were by far the most terrifying thing I'd ever experienced while hiking up to that point in my life. And I'm not gonna lie, even though I ended up being fine, obviously, this incident scarred me for years to come. It took a long time before I felt even somewhat comfortable camping by myself again. And I'm not gonna lie, even to this day, I still get pretty uncomfortable if I hear thunder off in the distance. Thankfully, the area that I was camped in was below tree line. It was a very safe area, which I didn't really understand at the time. I just got lucky. But man, this story left a lasting impact on me and actually influenced my actions in this next dangerous story, and definitely not for the better. So the next summer, I found myself back in the White Mountains, and this time I brought along a girl that I was dating at the time. Now, this girl had hiked before a decent amount, but I don't think, it's been a long time now, but I don't think that she had ever backpacked before. And having the experience I do now and knowing what I know today, in this circumstance with someone who had no backcountry camping experience, I would have paid very close attention to the weather forecast, and I also would have chosen a route that was pretty easy. Instead of doing that, my naive 19-year-old self decided that we were gonna hike a mountain called Owl's Head, which is yet another peak on the New Hampshire 48 4,000 footers list. The reason I chose Owl's Head is because I was trying to do this list, and I wanted to check it off the list, which was selfish because, as we eventually found out, this was not the right place for somebody's first overnight backcountry trip. We started off from the Lincoln Woods trailhead, and we slogged a number of miles through rough but relatively flat terrain, and we also crossed a number of rivers. At this point, we were deep inside the Pemigewasset wilderness, and though the rivers were at a normal level, I mean, this is a wilderness area, there's really no bridges at all. So every time that we would come to a river, and again, there were a bunch of these, we had no choice but to just send it right through the river, get our feet wet, that whole thing. But regardless regardless of that, eventually we did get to the base of Owl's Head. And from here, the trail follows what we call a slide. And it just kind of shoots straight up over loose rocks, kind of in an opened, clear area until you finally reach the summit. We scrambled up the slide. We tagged the summit of the peak. Yay, I got to check another one off the list. And then we turned around. At this point, it was getting later in the afternoon, and our plan, or I guess I should say my plan, I was the one leading this trip. She was just along for the ride. My plan was for us to get back down the slide and then hike back a couple miles in the direction of the car before finally setting up camp. Then the next morning, we would just hike the remainder of the way, backtracking back out to the trailhead. We were almost down the slide when things began to unravel. I could see off in the distance that an afternoon thunderstorm was fast approaching, and I'm not gonna lie, the first thing that entered my mind was the traumatic experience in those same mountains that I had had the year before. But we were only looking at the storm off in the distance. It hadn't actually hit us yet, and so I still had time to decide what we should do. And of course, I'll tell you what we ended up doing, but first I'll tell you what we should have done. At the bottom of this slide were a bunch of flat and safe campsites. There was a river right there, so there was water, there was fire pits, there was everything we needed. We could have set up right there. And we also got down to these campsites with plenty of time to set our tent up before the storm hit, so we could have set up, we would have been comfortable, we could have gotten inside the tent, and we would have been fine. We would have been sheltered, we would have been dry, and the storm would have passed over us very quickly. In hindsight, this is obviously the thing that I should have had us do. But instead, I got spooked, and I made a very rash decision that we were going to instead book it down the trail and try to outrun the thunderstorm. Come here and let me tell you something. You can't outrun a fucking thunderstorm. You can't do it. And of course, we didn't make it very far before, just like the previous year, the storm was right on top of us. I'm talking lightning flashing through the woods, thunder crashing all around us at the same exact time, and it started to downpour hard. And instead of being safe and sound and dry inside of our tents, we were just ripping it down the trail, which is very unsafe for anybody to do, but especially an inexperienced backpacker who had never carried like a heavy backpack. My ex-girlfriend easily could have rolled an ankle or fallen and hurt herself in this situation. We're just we're rushing down the trail over very difficult terrain, and that's nothing compared to the danger that I put her and myself in when we reached the rivers that we had to recross. Because of the torrential downpour, these rivers were now rising and raging fast. The current in these rivers was now way stronger than it was when we had came in before, and neither one of us, especially her, had the level of experience necessary to be hastily rushing through multiple dangerous river crossings like this. The fact that I led us through this and the fact that I had us do this was just reckless of me. I mean, there was a few times where I had to give her my trekking poles in order to help stabilize her so that she could get across these dangerous rivers. And in case you didn't get the memo already, this wasn't just one or two. There was a bunch of these. And again, all the while that we're going through these rivers, thunder is crashing down all around us. Thank God we did make it out okay, and eventually we set up camp, and of course everything, including the inside of our tent, our sleeping bags, everything was completely soaked. This was definitely probably one of the dumbest things I've ever done, and some of the worst decision making I've ever made. Well, I mean, I just cringe when I think back on this situation. And I also cringe at the thought of this next story, because let's just say that if it had been a few degrees colder, rescuers surely would have had to drag my frozen body off the mountain, which is a bold statement. And so once again, young, naive, and eager Kyle made some bad decisions on the trail. This time, I think I was only 17 years old, and it was November of 2012. Those of you that live in the Northeast know that in November, there might not be any snow on the ground in town, but at the higher elevations, there can definitely be some accumulation. I should have known this, obviously, but I was 17 and dumb, and I didn't think about it. And so a friend of I headed out on the long trail in northern Vermont and decided to spend the night in the woods. I was not expecting snow on this hike, and so as a result, I wore cotton pants like a total idiot. I mean, you should never wear cotton hiking any time of year, but especially in cold, wet conditions, this is a recipe for disaster. Cotton does not dry out easily, and it loses its insulating properties when it gets wet. It can also freeze, obviously, if it gets wet. After a day of hiking through snow and slush, I was completely soaked, and I was wet, and I was cold. I had some basic cold weather clothing with me. I had a warm warm-ish ski jacket. I did have a winter hat, had some small gloves, and I had a 30-degree sleeping bag, which maybe that sounds like a lot to you, but it wasn't. Temperatures that night were easily in the teens, say around -9 degrees Celsius from my understanding, and my sleeping bag was just a cheapo one I got on Amazon that was definitely not as warm as it was advertised to be, even though the advertised temperature was still not going to be sufficient for this trip. So all that combined with some now useless soaked cotton pants, well folks, this was just a recipe for disaster. My friend Dan and I rolled into a shelter on the long trail called Tillotson Camp shortly before sunset, completely exhausted. The hiking that day had been much harder than we thought it would be, largely due to the fact that we were slipping and sliding on the snow all day, and man, I'm telling you, we were getting cold. I figured that once I ate dinner and I got into my sleeping bag, I would warm up a little bit and eventually drift off to sleep. Let me tell you folks, there is no worse feeling than getting into your sleeping bag, your final layer of warmth, and still being just totally freezing cold. I'm not talking a little uncomfortable, like maybe, you know, oh my God, it's a little cold. I'm talking straight up shivering, no chance at sleep cold. We did not sleep that night at all. We shivered and shivered until finally, hours later, the sun came up, and then as soon as it did, we got the hell out of there back to our car and just completely blasted the heat. This story is so dangerous because if it had been even 10 degrees colder that night, an extremely uncomfortable situation could have quickly turned into a deadly one. We had no idea it was going to be that cold, and if it had just so happened to be in the single digits that night, say, well then I had wet clothing, I had an inadequate sleeping bag, I would have been totally screwed. We also didn't bring tents on this hike since we were planning on sleeping in the shelter. And so if we hadn't made it to the shelter for whatever reason, I mean, we would have been screwed. Things could have ended tragically for sure. Clearly, I made some bad choices on the trail in my younger days, and thankfully I've learned from them, and I haven't made any choices like that in a long, long time. However, while good decision making can mitigate most risk in the outdoors, it can't mitigate every risk. And so these next two stories are much more recent, and these are just wrong place, wrong time scenarios. When people think about dangers associated with the outdoors, dangerous animal encounters are usually one of the first things that comes to mind. Bears, mountain lions, snakes, these are probably the animals that people usually think of first. And while all those animals definitely can be dangerous, experienced thru hikers know that there is yet another animal besides those that is far more likely to hurt them. The animal that I'm talking about here would be the dog. Now, mountain trails that are deep in the backcountry rarely have dog problems, but there are a lot of long distance trails out there that require frequent road walks or at least road crossings, and these trails are where hikers really need to be alert to the dangers that random dogs pose. Unfortunately, many people who live along these trails do not keep their dogs leashed or fenced in. A lot of these are just like very rural roads, very rural areas. People have large amounts of property, so they're not really thinking about these things. And as a result, angry, protective dogs will often charge at hikers who are walking by their property along the road. I had heard many stories from friends about sketchy dog encounters, but it wasn't until I was through hiking the Washita Trail in 2022 that I finally had one of these sketchy encounters myself. I was actually on my second to last day of the 2-week, 220-mile walk through Oklahoma and Arkansas, and at one point I crossed a road, and just as I was following the trail back into the woods, I heard some barking. And when I heard it, I instantly felt chills run down my spine. And that's because I had actually been warned about a dangerous dog at this particular road crossing. But maybe there was some bad decision making, because up until this moment, I had actually completely forgotten about the warning. I was using an app called Far Out, which is basically like a GPS app for thru hikers, and it has a feature where hikers can leave comments about various trail conditions or like trail information. And on that app, I had read a number of comments about this particular road crossing where multiple hikers had encountered an aggressive dog that had followed them down the trail, angry as hell that someone had dared walk next to their property. But I had just completely forgotten about these comments up until the moment I heard that barking. And as soon as the barking started, before I even saw the dog, I knew that I was going to be in for some trouble. And sure enough, just a few seconds later, an angry, snarling dog came running through the brush right at me. The trail ran adjacent to the dog's property, so I could understand, you know, these dogs, like, they want to protect their property, and so I could understand if the dog just ran up to the property line and kind of stood there guarding it, but that's not what happened. This dog left its property and came right onto the trail, and it finally stopped about 6 feet in front of me. And I'm sure that pretty much all of you are probably wondering what kind of dog it was, and I wish I knew, but I can't remember for sure. I didn't get it on camera. It might have had some pit bull in it, but I really wasn't able to identify the breed. It kind of looked like a mix to me. And as far as the size goes, it was solidly a medium-sized dog. It wasn't like a Great Dane or giant, but it definitely wasn't an ankle biter either, although this dog definitely wanted to bite my ankles and more. I honestly didn't know what to do. I knew that I couldn't outrun the dog, and so I decided to kind of just treat it like a bear encounter. I started talking to it in like a firm but not like aggressive voice, and I just kept slowly walking down the trail. I wasn't running, but I wasn't, you know, challenging the dog either. This dog would not let up, and I think the sketchiest part was that every time I would turn my back to try and continue down the trail, the dog would start lunging at me until I turned back around. Like, I could not turn my back to this dog because it would have come after me. This freaking dog, dude, I mean, it just knew that I was more vulnerable with my back turned. And because of that, I believe that this dog was fully intent on attacking me if it could find the right opportunity. I ended up extending my trekking pole and kind of placing it between me and the dog, and I just kept slowly walking, kind of like this, and the dog kept following. It kept barking and attempting to lunge at me for a good, I don't know, at least 1/10 of a mile. And at this point, by the way, I was well away from its property. You couldn't even see its property anymore. I mean, I wasn't even close. Fortunately, the dog did stop at some point. It didn't run away, and it definitely didn't stop barking, but it did just stop in its tracks, and it just watched me as I hiked further off into the distance. And so I got away unscathed. I didn't get bit, but damn, if that didn't scare the shit out of me, like, I'm telling you, I've seen numerous bear over the years. I've seen moose up close. I've seen tons of rattlesnakes, and this dog encounter was by far the sketchiest animal encounter I've ever had while hiking. My hiking partner, Luke, was about a mile behind me at the time, and so I actually gave him a call to warn him about the dog, and he didn't really seem very concerned. When we finally caught up to each other at camp later that evening, Luke actually told me that the dog had charged at him as well, but instead of like playing it cool and trying not to get too aggressive with it like I did, Luke said that he just stood his ground and he actually screamed at the dog, which sent it running back in the direction that it came from. I also have another friend who was charged by an aggressive dog on the Florida trail, and he also stood his ground and like yelled and kind of like was aggressive towards the dog, and that worked for him as well. And so I think that if I do ever encounter another aggressive dog like this, I'm going to be a little more aggressive back to it in response. This is just anecdotal, but that seems to be what your best chances are.
Okay, so let me tell you what happened a few miles ago. This probably literally happened like less than an hour ago. A couple days ago, or maybe it was yesterday or something, I read a comment on Far Out at one of the road crossings I passed that said they got chased by a dog. And then when I crossed that road, sure enough, barking off in the distance. I'm like, great, here we go. I instantly remembered the comment, and a dog comes running right up to me. Probably, honestly, the sketchiest like animal encounter I've ever had.
Even though I was only in danger for a few minutes, it felt like that dog was following me forever. But the danger in this next story came and went so quickly that I didn't even have time to process it until after it was all over. Some of you have heard this story before. You might even remember it from my Pacific Crest Trail vlogs back in 2022, but I've also had a lot of new viewers since then, and so this story is going to be new, I think, for most of you. In 2022, I was through hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, but as I approached the Oregon-Washington border, I decided to take an alternate called the Eagle Creek Trail. Most PCT hikers will take Eagle Creek, and it apparently had some pretty sweet waterfalls and stuff, and so my hiking partners and I decided, why not? What could possibly go wrong if we take this different trail? The Eagle Creek Trail was in a burn zone, which is an area of the forest that had previously been completely decimated by a forest fire. But this fire was years old. The trail had since been cleared, and it was 100% open when we went through. The first part of the Eagle Creek Trail was awesome. We stopped and we went for a swim, and then we started hiking along the edge of a huge drop-off. The trail had essentially been carved out of an incredibly steep slope. On our right was a wall of earth, and on our left was a roughly 200-foot drop, super far down, and this drop ended at the waters of Eagle Creek itself. So we're going along, and at some point, Brandon, myself, and Flossie, the other folks that I was hiking with, had kind of spaced out in that exact order. Brandon was some 30 yards in front of me, and then Flossie was roughly 50 yards behind me. I was actually hiking along with my headphones in. Dude, I was rocking out, and I was pretty, I would say somewhat oblivious to what was going on around me. And then all of a sudden, I started to feel the earth shake. So this entire story all happened in like a split second. So I didn't really have time in the moment to process what was going on, but my gut started to tell me that a tree was falling from the right side of the trail. I looked up and I saw Brandon huddled up against the wall side of the trail. It looked like he was trying to kind of get up against the wall to protect himself from something coming down from above us. And I think the worst part about it was he looked extremely scared. Seeing that look on his face really freaked me out, because Brandon is a very lighthearted, fun guy. And so seeing this fear in his eyes, I don't know, this just instantly told me that something very bad was about to happen. All of this is just happening so fast. And so in this moment, I just started to run. I ran up the trail towards Brandon. I could just tell that something was coming down the slope on the right of me. And if it hit me, I would have either been flattened or it would have knocked me the 200 feet off the drop-off down into the river. That was a fall that I was not gonna survive. Now, I didn't see what happened because I was running away from it, but Brandon was looking back at me, and so he saw all of this unfold right in front of his eyes. According to him, a giant boulder the size of a small car, that's what he said, came tumbling down the slope, crossed over the trail, and then off the cliff, eventually falling into the river below. When this boulder hit the water, it sounded like a bomb had gone off. And again, according to Brandon, the boulder was about 15 yards behind me when it finally came over the trail, which is very close already. But just think about if I hadn't started running, if I was still just going along, then who knows?
Something fucking crazy just happened. A freaking huge rock just fell off of this cliff. Brandon was standing like right where I am. Right where these rocks are is where it came over. And I just freaking booked it when I got right here. I was probably about right here maybe when it actually fell. So pretty close. Oh my God.
I just had the picture ingrained in my mind of looking up, seeing Kyle, because he was like, just kind of, you know, wasn't sure what was going on. So, and then I looked and he saw me, and then he just started taking off and the rock just...
One of the sketchiest things about this incident is that the boulder came down between me and Flossie. Again, he was about 50 yards behind me, but it literally split the middle between us. If we had all been hiking close to each other, you know, 1, 2, 3, then who knows what could have happened. This is one of those freak accidents or incidences that, like, there really isn't that much to learn from. It's so random and rare. I guess you could say that I shouldn't have been wearing headphones, but I still think I would have reacted in the same way. So, I don't know.
On February 12th, 2015, Chris Sylvia set out on a section hike of the Pacific Crest Trail in Southern California. Chris kept a pretty low profile, and so we don't really know a lot about how his hike started. And unfortunately, we know even less about how it ended. A few days into the hike, Chris Sylvia called his roommate / best friend in order to get picked up from the trail. They chose a time and place to meet, and when that time rolled around, Chris's friend showed up, but Chris did not. It didn't take long before people became concerned about Chris, and the same day that the search was started, investigators made a discovery that looked innocent at first, but would soon prove to be anything but that. It may not look like much, but I think that this is the most disturbing photo in Pacific Crest Trail history. It features pretty much all of Chris's gear laid out right on the side of the trail. And yet, despite finding this just a few days after Chris went missing, he was never seen again. We don't know who arranged Chris's gear like that. It could have been him, certainly, and there's also some suspicion that it could have been somebody else. Either way, whoever was present at that scene likely holds the answers to one of the strangest disappearances in Pacific Crest Trail history. In mid-February 2015, 28-year-old Chris Sylvia decided that he needed to get away from home for a little bit to clear his head. In order to do this, he set out to hike a portion of the Pacific Crest Trail, which is a long-distance footpath that runs border to border from Mexico to Canada. The portion of the trail that Chris was on is much closer to the Mexican border, however, and on February 12th, Chris started out near the town of Anza and began hiking south. It seems as though his intention was to hike nearly 150 miles all the way down to Campo, California, which is right on the Mexican border. It's also the southern terminus of the trail, but I'm not exactly sure about this. I only saw a few reports that said that. There's not much known about the first few days of Chris's hike. It seems like he kept a pretty low profile, and there's also not a lot of people on the PCT that time of year, although it's certainly not unheard of. The first known contact that anyone had with Chris after he started his hike, at least that I was able to find, was on February 16th, 4 days after his departure. And unfortunately, this would also be the last contact that anybody had with him. On this day, Chris called his best friend slash roommate in order to arrange a meetup for the next day. I actually had the pleasure of speaking to Chris's brother about this arranged meetup and the circumstances leading up to it, and this is what he told me. Apparently, there had been some tension between Chris and this friend due to work and living circumstances, and a big reason why Chris had actually gone on this hike in the first place was that so he could get out there and clear his head and, quote, work things out for himself. On February 16th, Chris had apparently called this friend kind of out of the blue, like the friend wasn't really expecting it, and Chris asked the friend to pick him up the next day, but he kind of caught the friend at a bad time, and so Chris didn't really get the answer that he was expecting or hoping for, and this left him hurt and taken aback. However, the two were still able to agree on a time and place for the meeting, and it was scheduled for the next day, February 17th, at a Buddhist temple on Chihuahua Road. Now, this temple isn't directly on the PCT. For my calculations, it's about 5 miles off the trail. It's not uncommon for people to go off the trail to random spots like this when they're on backpacking trips. Although I will say I hiked most of the PCT in 2022, and when I went through here, I didn't hear or see any signs, nothing about this Buddhist temple. On February 17th, Chris's friend showed up at the temple at the exact time that he was supposed to, but Chris didn't. Now, in hindsight, Chris not showing up probably should have been a pretty big red flag, and a search probably should have been started right there and then, but that's not what happened. Chris's friend waited there for him for about an hour, and then he had to get going because he had another obligation, and he simply figured that Chris had decided to just keep hiking and just hadn't bothered to tell him about it. This is what he assumed, and he didn't really think that much of it, apparently. It probably wasn't a wise assumption, but I'm not going to judge the friend too much here because apparently him and Chris were literally best friends. They were very close, and it seems like there's no doubt that this friend really did have the best intentions in mind, especially because about a week later, on February 24th, it was this same friend that ended up alerting authorities when Chris never showed up at the end of his hike. It's at this point that the search for Chris was started. Multiple agencies came together, including Sheriff's Department volunteers, San Diego Mountain Rescue, and even the U.S. Border Patrol. They searched the ground on foot and with canine units and the air by helicopter. The search teams were definitely a formidable force, but unfortunately, they weren't able to locate Chris. However, it wasn't long before they were able to locate what seemed like a pretty promising clue, though ultimately this clue would just end up raising even more questions than it answered. On February 24th, the same day that Chris was reported missing, some hikers found a sleeping bag, a sleeping pad, a backpack, and some other gear laid out on the side of the PCT. It was quickly determined that this gear belonged to Chris Sylvia, and they even actually found his ID with all of the gear. The location on the trail that they found all of this gear
is kind of interesting to me. It's right around mile 127. Now, when I hiked through this area back in 2022, I didn't know about Chris's case. However, I do remember this specific part of the trail because it's very close to a common PCT stopping point called Mike's Place. I only stopped at Mike's Place very briefly just to fill up my water bottles, but my understanding is that it's basically a private residence that has some services for hikers. They'll let you camp on the property, cook you some food, maybe shuttle you into town. I'm not really exactly sure, but people who just basically open up their property and their home to hikers when they live really close to the trail is pretty common on all long distance trails. Chris's gear was found laid out right on the side of the trail, just a few hundred feet away from the intersecting trail that leads over to Mike's Place. This location also happens to be only a few hundred feet away from the intersecting Lost Valley Road, which is the remote dirt road that Chris would have taken to get over to the Buddhist temple to meet his friend. The search for Chris continued for 2 weeks, and other than the discovery of all of his gear on the side of the trail, no other sign of Chris was found. No known sightings of Chris occurred. It was almost as though he had just simply vanished. And unfortunately, at this 2-week mark, the search for Chris was suspended indefinitely. Jan Cadwell, who was the San Diego County spokesperson at the time, was quoted saying, "It's been 2 weeks since he was last heard from, and the weather has made a productive search impossible." So I guess they basically just called off the search because of some really, really bad storms. The search was stopped, but the investigation continued, obviously. But unfortunately, that was pretty much the last update that I've ever heard of from Chris's case. And so at this point, I really have nowhere to go back to except for the photograph. This photo isn't shocking, it doesn't really jump out at you, and it doesn't even really look that out of the ordinary. However, this photo just really creeps me out, and I think it's because I can't tell why Chris's gear is laid out like that. For those of you that are new here, I'm not just a storyteller, I'm an avid backpacker and thru hiker myself. And so I'm trying to look at this photograph through the lens of my experience on the trail and try to figure out what exactly is going on here. And honestly, it just confuses me. The first thing that comes to mind is that Chris laid out his gear like this to do what us thru hikers call cowboy camping, which is when you sleep on the ground without any sort of shelter. Like, you don't set up your tent, you don't do anything. It's extremely common for PCT hikers to sleep like this. A lot of people do it when they're on the trail. However, I'm not sure that this is what he was doing, because when you look at the photo a little bit closer, it looks like his sleeping pad is actually set up like kind of at a slant. You can also see a few rocks underneath the pad, so I don't know, it just doesn't really look very comfortable. There's no shortage of flat, clear spots to lay down on this part of the PCT, so I don't know, the cowboy camping thing just seems unlikely to me. The next plausible scenario is that Chris maybe just stopped to take a lunch break there or some sort of break, and that would explain why he didn't really pay much attention to where he put his pad down. However, if that was the case, why would he have taken out his sleeping bag? That's not really a normal thing for hikers to do when they're just stopped in the middle of the day. It's possible that since it was February, after all, he was cold, and so he took it out in order to get some more warmth. It's also possible that maybe his sleeping bag got wet somehow, and so he was laying it out like that to dry it. I don't know. I have a lot of questions about why his gear was laid out like that, but at the end of the day, I don't know if it really matters that much, because there's a much bigger question at stake here, and that's why wasn't Chris with all of his gear? I'm gonna be honest, guys, I don't always put my opinion in here, but my opinion is that this photo looks staged. That's just me. I don't have any real evidence of this, and there's probably a lot of people that are going to disagree that are much smarter than I am. But I don't know, just the circumstances of the case and just the way things are laid out, the location of it, something just seems off. Let me know in the comments if you guys think it looks staged or what you think is going on here. It's just very bizarre, and unfortunately, all we can really do at this point is speculate and just go through a few scenarios that could have possibly led to Chris disappearing. The first scenario is that Chris could have staged the scene with his gear like that in order to throw off investigators and then simply ran away. He could have done this to run off and take his own life, or he could have done this to get away and just start a new life somewhere. Again, this is total speculation. I don't have any real evidence for either one of these theories, but I will say that in some online forums and discussions, Chris's brother did seem somewhat open to the idea that maybe Chris did just run off somewhere to start a new life. In one forum, Chris's brother wrote, "He's certainly the the type to just go running off without telling anyone. Now, Chris's brother didn't say that he's like 100% convinced that this is what happened, but he did say that he could certainly see it being a possibility. It's also known that Chris was suffering from depression at the time of his disappearance, and he had even attempted to take his own life some years earlier. And so, as much as it pains me to bring this up, of course, I do think that it's fair to at least float the possibility that maybe he ran off and attempted to take his own life again. That being said, I'm gonna keep saying this, but I just want to be clear, like, we don't have any actual evidence of this. There was no note ever found. As far as I'm aware, there's no other indication that this was what happened other than the fact that he was depressed and he had attempted it years earlier. So I don't know. The last scenario that involves Chris intentionally disappearing was actually brought up to me once again by his brother. He speculated that it's possible that Chris was recruited by the 12 Tribes cult and was encouraged to leave his belongings behind and not contact anyone. I'll admit this scenario seems pretty far-fetched to me, although it is true that 12 Tribes has a presence on the PCT as well as lots of other long-distance trails such as the Appalachian Trail. I actually made an entire video on the 12 Tribes and their relation to the Appalachian Trail a few months ago. I'll have a link to it right here if you're curious. When I hiked the PCT, I didn't see or hear anything about 12 Tribes being out there, but I have since heard from other hikers who said they did interact with 12 Tribes at some point along their hike, so I don't know, they're definitely on the PCT. Now, that alone is certainly not evidence that they have anything to do with Chris's disappearance, obviously, but I don't know, it's a theory that's been floated out there by some people, and Chris's brothers seemed to be somewhat interested in that theory. So because of that, I thought that it would definitely be worth mentioning here. So now let's discuss the very real possibility that Chris did not disappear willingly, aka the possibility that maybe he was met with foul play. The first scenario that may have popped into a lot of your heads is that Chris's best friend slash roommate may have had something to do with his disappearance. This was one of the first things that I thought of because, again, his friend was supposed to meet him. His friend, I guess, would have been the last person to see him if Chris had showed up on time. I don't have any evidence to support or contradict this theory. I will say though, the authorities have never once come out, at least that I'm aware of, and named this roommate slash best friend as a suspect in Chris's disappearance. And Chris's brother, who has spoken with this roommate many times over the years, also never gave me any indication that he was suspicious of the friend. We know that this friend and Chris were very close. I've described them as best friends a few times in the video. That's my understanding. And so I don't know, it just seems unlikely that this friend would have caused him any harm. It's also worth mentioning that this section of the PCT Chris was on is fairly close to the Mexican border, which opens up the possibility that he could have accidentally come across an illegal drug smuggling operation and ran into trouble with that. However, while his location is close to the border, it's far enough away that the likelihood of this happening is very low. A quick measure on Google Maps shows that the location where Chris's gear was found is about 55 miles straight line from the Mexican border, and there's also numerous roads and towns that intersect that line. So I don't know, this theory just seems pretty improbable to me. And then of course there's always the possibility that he could have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time and run into some sort of person that was just looking to cause trouble. Again, no evidence of this. I don't know what happened to Chris. I don't know what's going on in this photo. I don't know why his gear was laid out like that. It's been almost 8 years since Chris disappeared, and none of the questions that we have about this case have ever been answered. Hopefully some answers are revealed soon. If you do happen to have any information about this case, please contact the San Diego County Sheriff's Department. And of course, my heart goes out to Chris and to his family. In January 2008, 22-year-old Jesse Pinar took a trip to the Hawaiian island of Kauai. Rather than just sightseeing for a few days and then returning to his home in Utah, Pinar's plan was to stay a couple of months to really soak in the adventurous Hawaiian lifestyle. Due to this, it's no surprise that he decided to hike the infamous Kalalau Trail on the northern shore of the island. In fact, he had actually hiked it multiple times before, and in March of 2008, he would hike it for the last time. Jesse Glenn Pinar disappeared on the Kalalau Trail, and now, 15 years later, we still don't know what happened. And as much as it pains me to say this, I'm not sure if we ever will, because the police in Kauai don't really seem very interested in finding him, and also because the call-out trail is cursed. His disappearance is far from the only baffling, tragic, or even downright evil thing to have occurred on it. This is the story of Jesse Glenn Pinar and the curse of the call-out trail. In the introduction of this video, I said that I'm not sure if Jesse Pinar's disappearance will ever be solved, and I really hope that I'm wrong about that. In fact, I'm even holding out a sliver of hope that maybe someone who watches this video might have some sort of information or experience that could help solve the case. But with that said, it's gonna be a tough one because the call-out trail is a beast. And I feel confident saying that because just a few weeks ago, I hiked it myself. Just started the call-out trail. They say it's one of the most dangerous trails in the country. I don't know. We're gonna find out. In January of 2008, 22-year-old Jesse Glenn Pinar flew by himself from his home in Orem, Utah to the Hawaiian island of Kauai. He rented an apartment there and he planned to stay for a few months to spend lots of time adventuring around the island. This is what he told his family, who he stayed in pretty regular contact with via cell phone while he was there. One of the trails he planned to hike was the Call-Out Trail, which is a 22-mile out and back route along the remote Nepali coast. The Call-Out Trail is pretty well known as being one of the most beautiful and also one of the most dangerous hikes in all of the United States. According to his sister Nikki, Jesse Pinar had hiked the Call-Out Trail multiple times during his stay in Kauai. He was also known to be a pretty experienced hiker and camper, so with all that in mind, you wouldn't think that he would be particularly vulnerable to something bad happening out there. By March of 2008, a few months after he had moved, Pinar was planning to take a trip back home to Utah for a family event, and he wanted to do one last hike of the Call-Out Trail before he left. He explained this to his family over the phone on March 24th, 2008. Unfortunately, that would be the last time that he was ever heard from. Once his family realized that something was wrong and that they hadn't heard from him for a little bit after he was supposed to be back from the hike, his father flew to Kauai to search for his son. He put up flyers offering a $5,000 reward for any information about what happened to Jesse. He searched his apartment and found nothing out of the ordinary. Everything seemed to be fine. Nothing looked suspicious. It really did look like Jesse had made good on his word to go and hike the Call-Out Trail one more time before returning home. It really did look like he had simply just disappeared out there. And interestingly enough, Jesse Pinar was not the first person to have disappeared on the Call-Out Trail. On January 23rd, 2004, 28-year-old Ohio native Bradford Turek flew to the Hawaiian island of Maui for a vacation and checked himself into a hotel. The next day, his rental car was found abandoned in the hotel parking lot, and bizarrely enough, several of his personal items were found at the bottom of the hotel pool. It appears that for some unknown reason, Turek changed his mind and left Maui for a different Hawaiian island, the island of Kauai. He flew to Kauai on January 25th, rented another car, and drove to Ka Beach, which happens to be the exact spot where the Call-Out Trail also starts. His rental car was discovered at Ka Beach a few days after he rented it, and we know for a fact that he was never seen or heard from again. But beyond that, a lot of the details of his disappearance seem pretty questionable in my judgment, so take the rest of this part of the story with a pretty big grain of salt. It's speculated that Turek hiked in on the Call-Out Trail about 2 miles until he reached Hanakapiai Stream, which is the first of 3 major river crossings on the Call-Out Trail. A t-shirt from Duke University was found submerged in the stream, and so it's possible that this shirt belonged to Turek. However, I do want to be clear, this t-shirt was never conclusively linked to him, and his family apparently doesn't necessarily believe it was his. They also found his initials carved into a tree near the stream, which is far from conclusive evidence that he was there, but it still suggests that he might have been. And finally, I did find one source online that
said that his family hired a private investigator who later uncovered that an illegal camper in the area had found a backpack at the stream that contained Turek's identification and his credit card. To me, that seems like it would be a really big deal, like kind of a bombshell in the case, but I was only able to find this mentioned in one source, and it was like a Facebook post too, and so I'm pretty skeptical about that piece of information, but I don't know if it's true or not. Clearly, we don't really know what happened to Bradford Turek, but we do know with certainty that he parked at the start of the Colorado Trail and most likely hiked in on it. Many speculate that he got swept away while trying to cross Hanakapiai Stream, which is entirely possible and definitely would not have been the first or the last time that happened. In fact, it's also possible that Jesse Pinegar maybe met his fate due to the rivers of Colorado or one of the many other dangers that the trail presents. Like I mentioned before, I hiked the Colorado Trail. It was just a few weeks ago, and one of the things that I was the most nervous about beforehand was the river crossings. Under normal conditions, these river crossings aren't that bad. Most hikers won't even need to get their feet wet when crossing them. What makes them so dangerous is that when it rains, the rivers rise fast, and they also start moving very, very fast. This wouldn't be a huge deal if it didn't rain very often, but the Nepali coast is basically a rainforest.
Soaked to the bone.
Multiple confirmed deaths have happened due to hikers being swept away on these rivers during flash floods. And in addition to that, many hikers will cross the stream safely and then come back to find that the water levels have risen, making it unsafe to cross back. This essentially leaves them stranded. In 2014, 121 hikers had to be airlifted off the trail due to the streams being uncrossable, including an 18-month-old baby and a 12-year-old boy. And the rivers aren't the only water-related curse of the Colorado Trail. Since the trail goes along the coast, there are a few beaches that hikers can stop at, including the famous Colorado Beach at the very end of the trail. Despite their beauty, these beaches are extremely dangerous. Hanakapiai Beach, which is the first beach on the trail just down from the river I previously mentioned, has allegedly claimed more than 80 lives alone due to the strong rip currents that pull hikers out to sea. The currents at Colorado Beach have also caused multiple hikers to drown. And while the trail does dip down to these beaches periodically, the crazy thing is most of the time you're actually walking on cliffs high above the water, which manifests as a whole different part of the Colorado Trail's curse. The cliffs are perhaps the most famous or infamous part of the trail. I'm not particularly afraid of heights, but due to the reputation of the cliffs on this trail, I was actually pretty nervous about it, especially because you have to do them twice because the trail is an out and back route. The most famous part of the trail is known as Crawler's Ledge, which is definitely sketchy, but there was also some other super sketchy parts immediately before and after the ledge. There's nothing technical about hiking on these ledges. The trail itself is pretty easy. There's just a really, really high penalty for any sort of misstep. But despite these ledges being so infamous, I was only able to find a few instances of hikers falling off of them. However, one of these instances is chilling, and to me, it's a clear sign of the curse of the Colorado Trail. In December of 2012, a Japanese visitor to Kauai experienced an absolute nightmare scenario on the trail. The woman was hiking with a man she had met a few days previously on the island when, are you ready for this? She was picked up and thrown over the edge of a cliff on the Colorado Trail. The man who did this was named Justin Klein, who had previously developed a rap sheet in Oregon. By some sort of miracle, the woman actually survived this and was able to get rescued. I'm honestly not sure how this happened, but thankfully it did, and the Colorado Trail was temporarily closed while the authorities searched for Klein. Eventually, after a 4-month manhunt, Justin Klein was captured in April of 2013. And that certainly wasn't the only criminal activity to ever have taken place on or near the Colorado Trail. For many years, the Colorado Valley, which the trail is named after, has had problems with illegal campers and squatters. These folks have been blamed for leaving large amounts of trash along the beach and the trail, hindering the pristine environment. In my judgment, it does kind of seem like this problem's getting a little bit better. I didn't notice any blatant signs of squatters when I hiked the trail, although there was one couple on the beach who were very nice, who just seemed like they had maybe been there for a little bit longer than they should have. Now, of course, this type of illegal activity is nothing compared to throwing someone off a cliff, but I just want to stress that this squatting in the Colorado Valley was pretty rampant. It wasn't just limited to like a few hippies over the years. There was quite a few people doing this, and quite a few people have gotten arrested for it. As far as I'm aware, other than the case of the woman being thrown off the cliff, I don't think these squatters have ever harmed anybody, but it still adds to the creepiness of the Colorado Trail knowing that there could be some desperate squatter living in the woods just off of the trail. Once again, I didn't experience this personally, but I did talk to another hiker who said he made a wrong turn on the trail and ended up walking down a little bit and actually did find like a little homeless encampment, and it really wasn't that far away from the trail. And it is also worth mentioning that my understanding anyways is that the squatting in the Colorado Valley was much more rampant back in 2008 than it is these days, aka when Jesse Pinar went missing. What is perhaps the creepiest and most recent sign of the Colorado Trail's curse happened just a few months ago in February of 2023. You can't make this stuff up, folks. Human teeth were found along the trail. You heard that right. About a dozen human teeth with no other signs of bones or remains were just found on the trail, just the teeth. It seems like this would be a pretty big deal, right? Especially given the history of some of the disappearances and the infamous nature of the Colorado Trail. But all I found were a few local news articles mentioning it, and that's pretty much it. I did read that the teeth were partially decayed and that the Kauai Police Department was, quote, working to determine if the teeth may be part of an ancient Hawaiian burial or possibly linked to one of the dozens of unsolved missing persons cases on Kauai. Hopefully in time we'll know who these teeth belong to and what the story is, but for now I think it's fair to just chalk it up to the curse of the Colorado Trail. Now, for the record, I do want to say that despite all these dangers and the weirdness and creepiness of the Colorado Trail, if you're an experienced hiker and you know how to keep yourself safe when it comes to bad weather and river crossings, you're gonna be just fine on this trail. I was just fine when I hiked it. Every single day people hike this trail, even people that aren't experienced, although I certainly wouldn't recommend that, and they're just fine. I will say though, after doing thousands of miles over the years on the East Coast, the West Coast, even a little bit in the Rockies, the Colorado Trail was just different than anything I've ever done. Maybe I just psyched myself out a little bit due to the trail's infamous nature. That's definitely possible, but I don't know. It just felt like on this trail, the stakes were a little bit higher and there was just less room for error. And in addition to that, there was parts of the trail where something just felt off to me, especially around the 5-mile marker. And that makes sense because the 5-mile marker of the Colorado Trail played a significant role in the disappearance of Jesse Pinar. Jesse Pinar did seemingly vanish into thin air, but that doesn't mean that he didn't leave behind some clues about where he had been and maybe what had happened to him. A few months after his disappearance, Jesse Pinar's family got some new information about their son. About 5 miles into the Colorado Trail, a hiker had discovered an abandoned campsite that looked somewhat suspicious, and because of this, the hiker reported it. Pinar's father flew to Kauai for a second time to investigate this, and at the campsite he found his son's iPod and some other various personal belongings. However, he did not find Jesse's wallet, his cell phone, or bizarrely enough, a quote chunk of change that Jesse was apparently known to hide in trees nearby when he was camping. But either way, this seemed like a pretty promising lead, but unfortunately it did not yield any results. Jesse Pinar was still nowhere to be found, and if I was going to stick to the theme of this video, I would just nonchalantly blame that on the curse of the Colorado Trail and move on. And I do think that the trail's curse plays a role in this. Obviously, that is the point of this video. But there is another side to the search for Jesse Pinar that I haven't really seen talked about in the media very much, and that would be the way that the police in Kauai did or perhaps didn't handle Jesse's case. I had the pleasure of speaking with Jesse Pinar's sister Nikki, as well as a few other family members, and they were all very adamant that the police did not handle his disappearance well. That's just their side of the story, of course. Maybe there's more to this, but I don't know. They are the family of the missing person after all, and so I think that their side deserves to be heard. Quoting from an email that Jesse's dad sent me, "A couple of weeks after I went on my first search, I received a phone call from someone who had met some hikers coming in from KA Beach to Colorado. No less than 10 separate hikers told the same story, that at mile 5 they had smelled something terrible. These hikers were familiar with the rotting smell of the two most common critters out there, pigs and goats. This smell was neither a pig nor a goat. The man advised me to call the police and ask them to bring in cadaver dogs to hunt for Jesse or the dead critters. It was the perfect time to do it because the smell was so strong at the time. The police declined to do this. I was very disappointed because it seemed like such an important lost opportunity." This wasn't the only circumstance where the police declined to help look for Jesse Pinar. In fact, according to his father, they didn't really help at all. A person at the police department even referred the family to someone outside of the police department, telling them that it was a waste of time trying to get the police to help. Like, what? The police also turned over evidence to Jesse's father, and based on his father's judgment, the police should have kept this evidence in order to help with Jesse's case. Once again, this was just their side, only one side of the story, but it is the family's side after all, so I think it's important to get that out there. To this day, we still don't know what happened to Jesse Pinar. The water below Jesse's campsite was searched by divers who recovered nothing. No additional gear of Jesse's has ever been found, and no new clues have been discovered at all. Pinar's sister Nikki says that she believes her brother either fell off one of the many cliffs nearby that area or was killed by one of the illegal campers in the valley due to all the money that Jesse would have had on him. Both these scenarios are entirely plausible, and it's also entirely plausible that if the police had actually taken any interest in solving this case, then we might have some real answers right now. But we don't. And perhaps the police's disinterest in helping is just yet another sign of the curse of the call-out trail. A curse that runs so deep that I actually didn't even get into all the mysteries that surround it, by the way. If you're interested in learning more about Jesse Pinar's case, as well as something called ambiguous loss, which is something that his family has experienced, I really encourage you to visit his sister Nikki's blog, which you can find at the URL below. I will also have a link to that in the description. And finally, please keep Jesse Pinar and his family in your thoughts and in your hearts. Thanks for watching, everybody. I did want to mention one more thing real quick. Jesse Pinar's sister has been very clear that even all these years later, after her brother had disappeared, his mother's love, faith, and hope for his return or case to be solved has never shaken. And she also wanted me to mention that it's always been a dream of her mother for her family to be able to go to Kauai and to all be together in the last place that Jesse ever was. They have a very, very big family, and so this is a very expensive thing to do. And so they are currently fundraising to try and make that happen. I'm not involved with the fundraising at all, but if you do want to learn more, you can contact Nikki at the email and Instagram handle in the description.
The Alaskan interior is one of the most deadly places in the world. Unpredictable weather, dangerous wild animals, and extreme remoteness makes it an incredibly difficult place to survive, and I'm sure that nobody understood this better than survival expert Tomas Cold. And with that said, perhaps the danger and challenges of Alaska were what drew him to it in the first place? Unfortunately, we'll never know the answer to that question because in the late fall of 2012, Cold left his cabin and trekked directly into the Alaskan wilderness only to never be seen again, dead or alive. After his disappearance, questions began to emerge. Where was Cold headed when he left his cabin? How did such a competent and experienced survivalist just vanish? And given all of his experience, should Cold have known better than to do what he did in the first place? I'll attempt to answer these questions and many more in this video, but the truth is that most of the questions surrounding this story will probably go unanswered forever. And you're going to understand why by the end of this video. This is the baffling disappearance of Tomas Cold from Gates of the Arctic National Park. Now, I need to give a disclaimer before we get into this story, and this is a disclaimer that I almost never have to give in these videos. I found a number of inconsistencies in the reporting on this story during my research. As far as I can tell, none of them are hugely important to like the meat of the story, but they're still concerning enough that I wanted to tell you about this before we begin. I don't know, just make sure that you take a lot of the events in this story with a grain of salt. But with that said, I still think this is an intriguing and important story to tell. Tomas Cold was a native German, but he had been living in Three Lakes, Wisconsin for 6 years prior to 2012. While living in Wisconsin, he had spent extensive time training at the Teaching Drum Outdoor School, which describes its mission as, quote, to offer wilderness immersion and personal development experiences where you can learn directly from nature and discover what it means to be fully human. Cold was also an instructor at Teaching Drum. Now, in other places online, Teaching Drum has been described as essentially a survival school. They teach things like fire starting, shelter building, wild plant gathering, and a lot more. Now, that's certainly a very basic summary of what they do, but what I really want to illustrate here is that after 6 years at Teaching Drum, Tomas Cold was a very competent, even expert level survivalist. And his experience was not just limited to the woods of northern Wisconsin. Cold had spent time camping in the extreme north of Norway, so he was no stranger to surviving in extremely cold, harsh conditions. And according to one source I read, apparently Cold had nearly died in the boundary waters of Minnesota when he accidentally injured his leg with an axe. He was bleeding profusely, but was eventually reached by emergency personnel. I'm not sure if this is true, but if it is, it either shows that Cold was strong and able to survive in dire situations, or that he was a little reckless and capable of putting himself in danger. Or even, perhaps it shows a little bit of both. In June of 2012, Tomas Cold flew to Alaska and began what was supposed to be a 5-month journey in the state. He spent some time at a fish camp in the southeast portion of the state and then made his way to the Tanana River near Fairbanks. I apologize if I got that name wrong, by the way. The river, not Fairbanks. Compared to most cities in the United States, Fairbanks is small and isolated. However, for Alaskan standards, Fairbanks is a pretty big city. It's actually the second most populated city in the state. In September, Cold made a big leap, leaving the relatively populated Fairbanks area behind when he traveled to the Arctic village of Ambler, Alaska. Remote, isolated villages exist all throughout Alaska, and most of them can only be accessed by plane. These villages are largely inhabited by Alaskan natives and have very, very small populations. Ambler only had a population of 258 people in 2010. Ambler is also right on the border of Gates of the Arctic National Park. Now, when a lot of people think of US national parks, they obviously think of beauty and nature, but they also think of crowded tourist destinations, buses full of people, gift shops, and overpriced cafeterias. Now, don't get me wrong, I've been to a lot of national parks, and there's definitely some very remote territory within the national park system, but the truth is that many national parks these days feel crowded. Gates of the Arctic National Park, however, is very different. The park encompasses some 8 million plus acres of terrain and has exactly 0 established roads, let alone hiking trails within its border. I believe it's the second largest national park. Much like the villages that it borders, the vast majority of its visitors have to fly in order to access it. This results in Gates of the Arctic consistently being ranked as the least or second least visited national park in the entire United States. After arriving in the village of Ambler, Cold made his way some 30 miles north up the Ambler River eventually arriving at a cabin owned by a woman and her 13-year-old son. I believe they were contacts Seibold had made through teaching drum. Some reports stated Seibold walked the 30 miles to the cabin. Other reports said he paddled there with the woman and her son, so I'm not really sure what the truth is, but either way, we definitely know that Seibold made his way to this remote cabin. And we also know that this cabin would end up being the last place that Seibold was ever seen alive. He arrived and stayed with the woman and her son for an unspecified amount of time, but eventually they parted ways. Some articles state that the woman and her son left the cabin at the end of September, trying to make it back to civilization before the rivers froze over. Other articles state that Seibold left the cabin before the others departed and hiked out by himself into gates of the Arctic National Park. I don't know which story is true, but my hunch is that Seibold stuck around for some time after the others left, all the way into early October, and you're going to see why I think this very shortly. Seibold had shared some vague plans with others before he disappeared. Apparently, he was planning on exploring gates of the Arctic National Park by himself all the way until early November, at which point he would hike the 25 or 30 miles to the village of Kobuk. He had a flight out of Kobuk scheduled for November 11th, which would be the first leg of his journey all the way back to Wisconsin. But Seibold never showed up for that flight and was reported missing shortly afterwards. At first, confidence that he was still alive was very high. After all, he was a student of survival. If this was some random tourist trapped out in the Alaskan wilderness, especially at the end of the year when the temperatures are dropping, I'm sure everyone would have assumed the worst pretty much right away. But once again, Seibold was just about as prepared as you could possibly be for a situation like this. And even though the temperatures were getting very cold and the weather was getting worse by the day, as I stated earlier, he had literally spent nights camping in the winter in far north Norway. Obviously, something must have gone wrong for him to miss the flight, but everyone hoped that he was still out there alive. Searchers quickly descended upon the cabin Seibold had been staying in, and it's here that they discovered their first clues, the biggest of which was a makeshift journal. Now, I wasn't able to find the entirety of Seibold's writings, but the last date that appeared in the journal was October 7th, 2012. This date is the reason that I personally believe Seibold stuck around at the cabin after the mother and daughter that he was staying with had left. In his last journal entry, Seibold wrote that he was going to leave the cabin for a few days and hike around the national park and explore. There was no indication that he ever made it back to the cabin, and so the obvious question is, when Seibold left the cabin, where did he go? Unfortunately, we don't really know the answer to that question. There was some reports that his journal mentioned hiking and camping higher up in the mountains, and also that he wrote about prepping firewood for the cabin, which indicates that he was planning on returning. My understanding is that when Seibold left, he did not take his .22 caliber rifle or his .30-06 caliber rifle, both of which would have been very useful in a survival situation. Another clue was found on day 3 of the search for Seibold. A large O marked into a gravel bar was spotted from a plain roughly 8 miles north of the intersection between the Ambler River and Olenek Creek. Upon further inspection, searchers believe that this O was possibly made by Seibold to mark a spot where he left supplies. In reference to this discovery, one of Seibold's colleagues at Teaching Drum said, quote, "Because the circle has such strong meaning to Tomas, we think there's a high likelihood that he etched the sign." Alaska State Troopers, along with local police departments, search and rescue volunteers, among lots of other groups, searched extensively for Tomas Seibold. The area that they covered was approximately 3,500 square miles of incredibly remote and harsh terrain. It was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. And, as if the search wasn't already difficult enough, the weather was taking a turn for the worst. Searchers experienced temperatures as low as minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Rivers froze over, but not enough to be safely traversed without risking submersion, which slowed them down. In many locations, the frozen ground made using four-wheelers all but impossible. And so, given how difficult the conditions were, search and rescue's best bet was to explore the area via planes and helicopters. Sergeant Duane Stone, one of the troopers leading the search, was quoted saying, "We've flown low enough to see wolverine, wolf, and bear tracks. We haven't found any sign of a human moving around at all in the area. In fact, the only sign of a human found throughout the entire search was the O marked in the ground." Searchers believed that Seibold may have built a base camp in the area near the intersection of the Ambler River and the Olenek Creek. Therefore, this spot was searched extensively, but yielded 0 additional clues. After 13 days, troopers called off the official search, citing dangerous conditions and lack of evidence as the 2 main reasons. But even after the official search was canceled, friends, family members, and colleagues from teaching drum continued to search to the best of their abilities. And one interesting part of this case is that as the search dragged on, people began drawing parallels between Seibold's story and the story of Christopher McCandless. I'm guessing that many of you have heard of the book/movie Into the Wild, which is based on the true story of a young man who decided to live off the land in Alaska all by himself. McCandless would end up living in an abandoned bus, but only survived about 3.5 months before dying of starvation. Hunters eventually found his body, and when they did, he only weighed about 67 pounds. Due to how famous the Christopher McCandless story was, it was easy for people to compare it to that of Seibold's. After all, both stories featured young men who had wandered off into the Alaskan wilderness all by themselves. Both men appeared to be on some sort of personal, spiritual journey, and by this point in the search, it seemed likely that both men had met similar tragic fates. However, despite these obvious similarities, there are also some key differences between Seibold and McCandless's stories. The most obvious difference is that Seibold, at least on paper, was prepared for the journey that he was undertaking, and this is due to all his survival training. Seibold also had a solid plan and an exit strategy. Obviously, something had gone horribly wrong when he left the cabin after October 7th. And that brings us to the biggest question of this entire video. What the hell happened to Tomas Seibold? And obviously, we don't have a solid answer to this question, but there are a few different theories that I think are worth exploring, even if they're just speculation. So, anytime somebody disappears without a trace, there's always going to be a theory about them running away to start a new life somewhere. And though this is technically possible, because we don't really know what happened, it does seem unlikely that this was the case with Seibold, and many of those who knew him don't really consider this a possibility. It seems like Seibold didn't really have any reason to run away, and I did read one article that said that he actually had a wife waiting for him back in Wisconsin, but once again, that's a piece of information I wasn't able to verify. And so if Seibold didn't run away, it's most likely that he died out there somewhere in the Alaskan backcountry. So what could have happened here? Well, it's always possible that he could have been the tragic victim of a bear attack. It's probably no secret to most of you that Alaska is crawling with bears. Both black bears and grizzly bears inhabit gates of the Arctic National Park. We know that Seibold did not take his guns with him when he left the cabin, which could have left him vulnerable to a bear attack. Now, this is unlikely. Bear attacks are extremely rare after all, but my understanding is that in the fall, bears can be a little extra dangerous due to increased hunger. These bears need to fatten themselves up before they go into hibernation for the winter. So this is a possibility, but in my opinion, the most likely scenario is that Seibold got injured or horribly lost and simply succumbed to the elements. Even with all of his survival experience, I still think this is entirely plausible. And that's because the area that he was traveling in is extremely dangerous in the fall and early winter, even to the point where many experienced local hunters and trappers steer clear of it. In reference to the area that Seibold went missing, Sergeant Dwayne Stone was quoted saying, "It is remote and it is hazardous even on Alaska standards. If trappers aren't going up there, it should give you kind of an idea." The final question I want to raise is, given Seibold's survival experience, should he have known better than to try and venture out on his own in an extremely remote location during a time of year known for volatile weather? To be clear, I'm not trying to victim blame here, but I do think this is a fair question. I'm sure Seibold understood the risks associated with his actions, but maybe he was being a little bit overconfident. Or maybe not. Maybe he just wanted to put himself up against the ultimate challenge, surviving in Alaska. Unfortunately, we'll never really know what exactly was going through his head. Due to how remote this area is, and due to the fact that it's been over 10 years now, I highly doubt we'll ever find a trace of Tomas Seibold and know the truth about what really happened to him. This story should serve as a cautionary tale. Even when you're extremely experienced in something, things can still go horribly wrong. Be sure to keep your guard up and be sure to be safe out there, everybody. My heart goes out to Tomas Seibold, his friends, and his family. And of course, thank you all so much for watching.